Hello, my friend. Settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight we're walking inside a 1950s suburban house. Not the version from the old advertisements, but the real one. The one lived in by the ordinary family who actually filled its rooms, into the kitchen before the sun is even up, into the laundry room on a Monday, into the quiet of an empty house at 2 p.m. when nobody's watching and nothing much is happening. And somehow, that is the most interesting part of all. Before we start, if you enjoy this kind of video, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps, and it costs you nothing. No pressure at all though. I am happy you are here regardless. What I would genuinely love to know is where you're listening from right now. A quiet bedroom somewhere in Ohio. A porch in Texas with the evening gone still. A flat in London with the city finally winding down. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is 5:50 in the morning, and the street is still almost completely dark. Not the deep black of midnight, but that particular greyish blue that comes just before the birds start, when the streetlights are still on but starting to look a little embarrassed about it, like they know their shift is nearly over. The house sits on a quarter-acre lot on a curved street that did not exist 5 years ago. Before that it was a soybean field, or an orchard, or sometimes just scrubland nobody had bothered with. And now it is Maple Terrace, or Rolling Hills Drive, or Sunset Court, one of 1,000 new names for 1,000 new streets that all seem to promise the same thing. Space, grass, a fresh start with a mortgage attached to it. The house itself is a modest rectangle. 1 story, what people are starting to call a ranch style, though this one leans more toward what the builder's brochure called a Cape Cod cottage, with a steep little roof and 2 small dormer windows tucked up under the eaves like eyebrows. It cost around $9,000 to build, give or take, financed through the kind of low-down payment government-backed loan that made this whole street, this whole town, possible in the first place. The clapboard siding is painted a pale robin's egg blue, chosen from 3 approved colour options because the builder found that too much variation slowed down construction and confused buyers who, it turned out, mostly wanted to feel like they had made a choice even when the choices were narrow. There is a single car attached garage, a poured concrete driveway still smooth and unstained, and a front lawn that the man of the house has been nursing along since April, with a diligence he does not apply to almost anything else in his life. Inside, the house is 1,100 square feet. That is the whole thing, every room of it, and it will strike you as almost impossibly small if you're used to houses built 60 or 70 years later. But to the family sleeping inside it right now, it is spacious. It is, in fact, roughly 3 times the size of the apartment the husband and wife shared during the first 2 years of their marriage, back when he was still finishing his degree on the government's dime and she was working the front desk at an insurance office downtown. This house, small as it is by later standards, represents something enormous to them. It represents having made it, in the specific and modest way that making it meant in this particular decade, in this particular kind of neighbourhood. Let us meet them properly. The husband's name, let us say, is Walter. He's 34 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who played some football in high school and has mostly kept the frame if not the conditioning. And he works downtown at an insurance company, not the glamorous kind of job anyone writes stories about, but a steady one. The kind with a pension at the end of it if you stay long enough, which he intends to. His wife is named Dorothy, though nearly everyone who knows her calls her Dottie, and she's 31, with light brown hair currently pinned into slightly damp curls from the pin curl set she put in before bed last night, the kind that will fall into soft waves by the time she has her coffee. They have 2 children, a boy, Tommy, who is 8, and has just started to lose interest in being read to, which quietly breaks his mother's heart a little, and a girl, Susan, who is 5 and still sleeps with a stuffed rabbit that has lost most of the fur on its left ear from being dragged everywhere for the better part of 3 years. Maybe you are Dottie this morning. Maybe you know exactly what it is to wake before the alarm rings, not because you want to, but because your body has simply learned the hour, the way certain muscles learn a task and perform it without asking permission. Maybe you have lain in a bed like this one. A double bed with a chenille spread the colour of weak tea, listening to the particular silence of a house that has not yet started its day, feeling the cool air through a window cracked an inch at the top, and thought about everything that has to happen before 8 o'clock. running through it the way you might run through a grocery list. Except the list is made of minutes instead of items. There is something worth noticing here before we go any further, something that does not get said out loud in this house, or in most houses like it, though it sits underneath almost everything that happens today. This house, with its blue siding and its little dormer windows, was sold to this family as the finish line, the reward at the end of the striving, and yet inside it, both of them are already, quietly, beginning to strive again toward the next thing, whatever that turns out to be. The finish line, once you cross it, has a way of becoming a starting line again almost immediately. Nobody warns you about that part. It is one of the small, quiet truths of a life like this one, and it will come back to us more than once tonight. The alarm clock on Dottie's nightstand goes off at 6, a small brass wind-up model with a tick you can hear from across the room if the house is quiet enough, and it is. She reaches over and silences it before it finishes its second ring, a habit born of not wanting to wake Walter, though he is already awake, and not wanting to wake the children, who are not yet. She swings her feet out from under the chenille spread onto a hooked rug that her mother made, feels the slight chill of the wood floor beneath it, and sits there for a moment, just a moment, gathering herself the way a person gathers themselves before stepping into cold water. Then she stands, reaches for her housecoat hanging on the hook behind the bedroom door, quilted pale yellow, with a zipper up the front, and heads for the kitchen, because the coffee, more than almost anything else in this house, cannot wait. The kitchen at 6 in the morning is dark except for the small light over the stove, which Dottie switches on with a practiced flick before she has even fully entered the room. It is a good kitchen, one of the reasons they picked this particular model of house over 2 others the builder offered. The cabinets are a pale mint green metal with chrome pulls, and they run the full length of one wall, broken only by the double basin sink beneath the window that looks out onto the small backyard, still mostly dirt where sod has not been laid yet, and a single young maple tree staked with wire to keep it standing straight against the wind. The refrigerator hums in the corner, a rounded white Kelvinator that Walter's mother calls the icebox out of habit, even though there has not been an actual block of ice involved in years, and beside it stands the real centrepiece of the room, a gas range with 4 burners and a built-in clock that Dottie is inordinately proud of, the kind of pride that surprises her a little when she catches herself feeling it. She fills the percolator at the sink, the water running cold and a little loud in the sleeping house, and sets it on the front burner, turning the dial with a small practiced twist. The gas catches with a soft whoomp and a ring of blue flame appears beneath the pot, and there is something almost ceremonial in the way she does this. The same 4 or 5 motions repeated every single morning of her married life so far, motions that have become so worn into her hands that she could do them in her sleep, and some mornings she suspects she nearly does. While the coffee begins its slow climb toward readiness, she moves to the counter and pulls down a mixing bowl for the children's oatmeal, though Walter prefers eggs, 2 of them, over easy, with toast, a preference she has accommodated so consistently over 6 years of marriage that she sometimes forgets it was ever a negotiation at all rather than simply the natural order of the kitchen. The refrigerator door opens with its particular suction sound, releasing a small breath of cold air scented faintly of milk and the leftover pot roast from 2 nights ago, and she takes out the eggs, the butter, a bottle of milk with cream still separated at the top, because homogenization has not quite become universal yet. Not on this street, not from this particular dairy that still delivers glass bottles to the metal box on the porch 3 mornings a week. Stay with me here for a second because I want to point something out that is easy to miss if you are moving too fast through a morning like this one. Every single motion Dottie makes in this kitchen before 6:15 has already been decided somewhere else, by someone else, in advance. The house was designed by a builder who consulted efficiency experts about kitchen triangle layouts. The stove was designed by engineers who studied exactly how a woman's arm moves between burner and counter. The very idea that breakfast should include eggs for him, and oatmeal for the children, and coffee, percolated rather than instant, because instant, she has decided, tastes faintly of tin, All of that arrived in her kitchen through magazines and radio programs and the quiet, persistent instruction of her own mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from a ladies' home journal that promised a happy husband was a fed husband, and a fed husband began with eggs done exactly right. And yet none of this feels to Dottie like following instructions. It feels like her kitchen, her rhythm, her small competent kingdom before the rest of the house wakes up and starts making demands on it. That contradiction, a life this scripted somehow still feeling this personal, is going to sit with us for the rest of tonight. Quietly, in the background. The way a low hum sits under a song without you quite noticing it is there until someone points it out. By 6:15 Walter is up, and the bathroom, the single bathroom this whole house has to offer, has become the site of a small, well-rehearsed negotiation. It is not a large room, done in pale pink tile that was, according to the builder's brochure, the height of modern taste, with a pedestal sink and a tub with a shower curtain rather than a proper shower stall, since separate showers were still something of a luxury feature in a house built to this budget. Walter shaves at the sink using a safety razor and a shaving brush. He works into a lather in a wooden bowl that belonged to his father, a small ritual that takes perhaps 4 minutes and that he genuinely enjoys. The warmth of the water, the scrape of the blade, the particular quiet of a bathroom before the rest of the house is fully awake. He examines his jaw in the mirror the way men of every era have examined their jaws in mirrors, with a critical eye that finds fault it cannot quite name. He dresses in the bedroom while Dottie finishes downstairs, and the closet, built into the wall with sliding doors rather than a proper walk-in, holds 4 suits, which is considered a respectable number for a man in his position, rotated through the work week with a system only he fully understands. Today is a grey flannel day, paired with a white shirt that Dottie ironed 2 evenings ago, and a tie in a deep maroon that his mother gave him for Christmas, and that he wears more often than he might otherwise simply because she asks, every time she sees him, whether he still likes it. He knots the tie in front of the small mirror on the closet door, a motion so automatic he could describe his day's meeting schedule, while doing it without missing a loop, which he sometimes does, out loud, to nobody, just to hear how it sounds before he says it to his boss. Down the hall, the children's rooms are beginning to stir. Tommy shares a room with nobody, a small private luxury of being the older child and not incidentally the boy, and his room is decorated in a manner that reflects his current and passionately held enthusiasms, a rotating cast that has included over the past year alone cowboys, a brief and intense fascination with the planet Mars following a radio serial, and currently baseball, evidenced by a pennant tacked above his headboard and a well-oiled glove sitting on his dresser like a trophy. He wakes slowly, the way 8-year-olds often do, burrowing deeper into the blankets for a few extra minutes of warmth before the inevitability of the day asserts itself. Susan's room, just across the hall, is smaller, really more of a converted alcove than a proper bedroom, since this particular house design assumed, when it was built, that a second child might come along and need accommodating in whatever space was left over after everything else had been allotted. It is painted a soft coral pink and holds a white painted spindle bed, a small bookshelf with perhaps a dozen well-worn picture books, and the rabbit, currently tucked under Susan's chin, its remaining fur damp from where she has, unconsciously, been chewing on its ear in her sleep, a habit her mother has tried gently to discourage without much success. Maybe you remember a version of this house, the specific creak of a particular floorboard outside a particular bedroom, the sound of a parent's footsteps that meant morning had officially, irreversibly begun. Maybe you are the child in this memory, still half in a dream, hearing your mother's voice from the kitchen calling that breakfast is nearly ready, and feeling that small, specific reluctance to leave the warm, private world of sleep for the day that is waiting, fully assembled, on the other side of it. Breakfast happens at the kitchen table, a chrome-legged table with a laminate top in a pattern of gold boomerangs that was, at the time of purchase 2 years ago, considered thoroughly modern, paired with 4 matching vinyl upholstered chairs. Walter sits at the head, nearest the window, a position that was never formally assigned but that everyone in the household understands to be his, the way certain arrangements in a family become fixed without ever being discussed. He reads the morning paper while he eats, folded in quarters the way his own father used to do it, scanning headlines about a border dispute somewhere and the latest from a Senate committee, occasionally reading a line aloud to Dottie, who listens with half her attention while she refills Tommy's milk glass and reminds Susan, for what feels like the 40th time this week, to eat her oatmeal before it gets cold, rather than simply stirring it into an ever more elaborate architecture of swirls. Here is a small fact I find genuinely interesting, one of those historical details that tends to get lost. The average American in this decade is by most measures eating more eggs, more milk, more red meat than any generation before or since would manage, a direct legacy of wartime nutrition science that had convinced an entire country that protein and dairy were the twin pillars of a strong household. Never mind what later decades would eventually have to say about cholesterol. Dottie has never heard the word cholesterol. Nobody at this table has. The eggs on Walter's plate this morning, and most mornings, are simply breakfast, unencumbered by any of the anxiety that would eventually attach itself to that particular food. The radio on the counter, a small brown Bakelite model with a rounded top, plays quietly through breakfast, tuned to the local station's morning program. A mixture of news, weather, and a man with an unnervingly cheerful voice reading advertisements for a furniture store having its annual sale. Nobody in the kitchen is really listening to it, not directly, but its absence would be noticed immediately, the way you might not consciously register a clock ticking until someone stops it. It is simply part of the room's atmosphere, along with the smell of coffee and toast and the particular quality of morning light coming through the window over the sink, which faces east and, on a clear day like this one, fills the whole kitchen with a warm gold that makes even the chrome table legs look, for a few minutes each morning, faintly beautiful. At 7:15, Walter finishes his coffee, folds the paper a final time, and stands, which is the household's signal that the leaving portion of the morning has begun. He retrieves his hat from the small table by the front door, a grey felt fedora that he wears less out of any particular fondness for hats, and more because a man in his line of work simply wears one, the way he wears a wedding ring or carries a leather billfold, an unremarked upon uniform of adulthood. Dottie meets him at the door with his lunch, packed into a metal lunch pail that morning, though on Fridays he usually takes her up on the offer of a nickel for something from the drugstore counter near his office instead. There is a kiss, brief, practiced, affectionate in the unshowy way of people who have kissed each other goodbye some 2,000 mornings running, and have found, in that repetition, not boredom exactly, but a kind of settled fondness that does not need to announce itself. He backs the car, a two-tone Chevrolet in green and cream, that he is still faintly privately thrilled to own outright, down the driveway and out onto the curved new street, joining a small procession of similar cars, similar men in similar hats, all converging toward the same handful of roads that will carry them downtown. This particular pattern of movement, thousands of men leaving thousands of nearly identical houses at nearly the same hour to travel to jobs in a city centre that the houses themselves are, in a sense, orbiting, is new enough this decade that the roads have not entirely caught up with it yet. There is a stretch of two-lane highway about a mile from the subdivision that backs up every single morning around this time, a minor daily frustration that Walter has, in 18 months of commuting, come to regard almost fondly, a small predictable obstacle in an otherwise orderly life, the sort of thing a man complains about at the office in a way that secretly signals that everything else is in fact going quite well. And now, for the first time today, the house is entirely Dottie's. Not entirely, of course. There are still 2 children to get out the door, and this particular morning happens to be a Monday, which carries its own weight in this household, a weight we will get to shortly. But there is a specific quality to the 40 minutes between Walter's departure and the children leaving for school, a kind of second, smaller morning nested inside the first one, less formal, a little looser at the edges. Tommy walks to school, along with most of the neighbourhood children his age, a fact that would surprise almost nobody living on this street, and that would astonish, frankly, almost everybody 2 or 3 generations later. The school is 8 blocks away, a low brick building finished only the year before last, built in a hurry along with two others just like it in neighbouring subdivisions, because the sheer number of children arriving in these new developments has outpaced by a considerable margin anyone's original planning. Tommy leaves the house at 7:45 with a canvas satchel over one shoulder, meets two boys from 3 houses down at the corner, and the 3 of them proceed towards school in the loosely organised, occasionally distracted manner of small boys everywhere, a manner that involves a fair amount of kicking stones and at least one detour to examine something interesting in a storm drain. Susan does not yet attend school in the full sense, not this year, though she will start kindergarten in September, a fact that Dottie has mixed feelings about, that she has not fully examined and probably would not admit to examining even if she had. For now, Susan's mornings belong entirely to the house and to her mother, a small orbiting presence who follows Dottie from room to room asking questions with the specific gravity that only a 5-year-old can bring to a question like why the sky does not fall down. Here is where I want to slow down for a moment and talk about something that gets flattened, I think, when we imagine this era from a distance, something that is easy to miss if you are only picturing the postcard version of the 1950s housewife. Dottie did not attend college, though she considered it briefly at 18, before deciding, in the particular calculus of the time, that a year or two of secretarial work, followed by marriage, made more practical sense. She is by any honest measure an intelligent woman, quick with numbers, an excellent reader, the kind of person who finishes the newspaper crossword most days before Walter has managed the sports section. None of that intelligence has anywhere obvious to go this morning, except into the management of a household, the negotiation of a 5-year-old's breakfast preferences, and the mental arithmetic of what needs to happen before noon. I do not say this to make the morning sound sadder than it feels from the inside, because it does not feel sad to Dottie, not this particular Monday, not most days. There is real satisfaction here, genuine competence being exercised, a house running the way she wants it to run because she is the one running it. But it is worth naming the shape of the container, even while acknowledging the real pleasure of what fills it, and we will come back to that thought more than once tonight, because it is one of the truer things about a life like this one, and I think it deserves better than a single tidy sentence that wraps it up and lets us move on too quickly. Monday, as I mentioned, carries weight in this house, because Monday is wash day, and wash day in a household of this era is not a task so much as it is a small, all-consuming campaign that will occupy the better part of Dottie's morning and well into the early afternoon. The washing machine lives in a small alcove off the kitchen that the builder rather grandly called a utility room, though it is really more of a wide closet with a window, just large enough to hold the machine itself, a deep basin sink, and a set of shelves for detergent boxes and bluing bottles, and a wicker basket that carries clothes out to the line. The machine is a Bendix, an automatic model that Walter's mother regards with something bordering on suspicion, since she spent 30 years working a wringer washer by hand and has never quite trusted a machine that claims to do the wringing for you as well. Dottie loves it without reservation. She remembers, as a girl, watching her own mother feed wet sheets through a hand-cranked wringer, an operation that once caught the sleeve of a neighbour woman's dress and gave everyone on the street a story to tell for a decade afterward. The automatic machine, by comparison, feels almost like magic, a low hum and a rhythmic sloshing that she can simply start and walk away from, checking back every so often the way you might check on something baking in the oven. But automatic does not mean effortless, not in this decade, not by a long stretch. The wash still has to be sorted first, a process Dottie has refined over years into an efficient, almost automatic sequence of her own. Whites in one pile, this includes sheets, undergarments, Walter's dress shirts, and any of the children's clothing pale enough to risk bleeding onto. Colours in a second pile, sorted further by how deeply set the dye is likely to be, a judgment she makes almost instinctively now, after enough ruined loads early in her marriage taught her which fabrics could be trusted together and which could not. And a third, smaller pile for anything heavily soiled, work clothes, Tommy's play clothes from the weekend with grass stains worked deep into the knees that will need a pre-treatment of some kind before they even go near the machine. The pre-treatment itself is a small ritual worth pausing on. Dottie keeps a bar of yellow laundry soap, harsh and unglamorous, specifically for rubbing directly onto stains before washing, working it into the fabric with her thumbs over the deep basin sink, the water running warm over her hands, the smell of the soap sharp and slightly medicinal in a way that, oddly, she finds satisfying rather than unpleasant. There is something almost meditative in this part of the morning, a task simple enough to require attention without requiring much thought, the kind of work that leaves a corner of your mind free to wander while your hands do something useful. The whites go in first, along with a careful measure of powdered detergent, a product still relatively new to the market and advertised with tremendous confidence as containing enzymes and brighteners that older soap flakes never could. Dottie adds a capful of liquid bluing as well, a faintly purple-tinted liquid that, counterintuitively, makes white fabric look whiter by cancelling out the slight yellow cast that plain washing tends to leave behind. A bit of practical chemistry passed down from her mother that she has never questioned and would struggle, if pressed, to fully explain. While the first load runs, she moves through the rest of the house with the particular efficiency of someone who has learnt to layer tasks on top of each other rather than complete them in a strict sequence. She strips the beds, a task that happens every single Monday without exception, gathering sheets and pillowcases into a bundle that goes into the second load, and remakes each bed with a fresh set from the linen closet in the hallway, a narrow closet lined with shelves holding neatly folded stacks of sheets in white and pale blue, towels in a matching pale yellow that she chose specifically to coordinate with the bathroom tile, and, on the top shelf, a few extra blankets rolled and stored in cedar-smelling paper for the winter months not yet arrived. Susan, meanwhile, has installed herself on the kitchen floor with a small collection of wooden clothespins, arranging them into what she describes, with total confidence, as a family, complete with a mother pin, a father pin, and two smaller pins representing herself and her brother, a game that occupies her happily enough for Dottie to get through nearly 2 full loads of laundry before Susan requires any real attention, beyond an occasional glance to confirm she has not wandered off toward anything more dangerous than a wooden clothespin. By 9:30, the first load is ready to hang, and this is where the morning moves outside, into the backyard, where a rotary clothesline stands on a metal pole sunk into concrete, its 4 arms strung with cord in a wide circle that Dottie can spin as she works her way around it, pinning wet fabric to the line with the same practiced economy of motion she brings to nearly every domestic task. There is a particular pleasure in this part of the work that she would find difficult to fully explain to anyone who has not done it. The physical sensation of cold, wet fabric against her hands on a morning that is otherwise mild, the smell of clean laundry starting to dry, faintly of soap and outdoor air, the small satisfaction of a sheet snapping taut in a breeze, and underneath all of it, a private, unspoken competition with her neighbours that nobody discusses openly but that everyone on this street participates in nonetheless. Because here is a detail that genuinely surprises people when I mention it, and it surprised me too the first time I came across it. In neighbourhoods like this one, in this decade, the appearance of a woman's laundry line was a small, closely watched matter of household reputation. Sheets hung crooked, or grey rather than white, or left out overnight, could become a quiet subject of neighbourhood commentary, the kind of judgment nobody would say to your face but that everyone somehow knew about anyway. Dottie is aware of this, in the way you are aware of a rule you were never formally told, but absorbed simply by living inside a particular world, and she takes a real, if slightly defensive pride in the whiteness of her sheets against the blue morning sky, in the neat, evenly spaced rhythm of her pinning, socks by size, pillowcases by pairs, an order that would mean nothing to a stranger and everything, in some small unspoken way, to the woman 2 houses down who is currently pinning up her own wash and glancing, whether she would admit it or not, in Dottie's direction. The second and third loads follow across the late morning, the rotation of wash, hang, and return inside to start the next batch, becoming its own kind of rhythm, one Dottie has performed so many times that her body seems to know the sequence better than her conscious mind does. She finds herself, at one point, standing at the clothesline with a wet pillowcase in her hands, looking out past the yard toward the young maple tree, its few leaves moving slightly in a breeze she can feel but not quite see, and she has one of those small, unbidden thoughts that arrive sometimes in the middle of ordinary tasks. A thought about nothing in particular, about the specific blue of the sky today, about whether her mother, 3 states away now, is doing something similar to this at this exact moment, a thought that arrives and then dissolves again almost before she has fully registered it, carried off by the next task waiting for her attention. Ironing day, in this household, technically falls on Tuesday, a separation Dottie maintains partly out of practicality, since Monday's wash needs a full day to dry properly on the line before it can be pressed, and partly out of a kind of inherited discipline that assigns each day of the domestic week its own particular character, an arrangement passed down through at least 2 generations of women in her family, and rarely questioned by any of them. But there are always a few items that cannot wait a full day, Walter's shirts among them, since he needs at least 2 crisp ones ready by Wednesday morning, and so a small informal ironing session happens most Monday afternoons, regardless of the official schedule. The ironing board lives folded against the wall of the utility room, unfolded and set up in the kitchen where the light is better, and where Dottie can keep half an ear on Susan while she works. The iron itself is electric, a genuine relief to Dottie, who remembers her grandmother's flat irons, heated directly on the stovetop and swapped out every few minutes as they cooled, a system that required near constant attention to avoid either an iron too cool to be useful or one hot enough to scorch. Her electric iron has a dial, a genuine luxury, allowing her to set a lower heat for Susan's cotton dresses and a higher one for Walter's shirt collars, which require a firmness of press that a cooler setting simply cannot achieve. There is a particular skill to shirt ironing that took Dottie the better part of a year of marriage to fully master, and she still, on occasion, feels a small private satisfaction in how far she has come since those early uneven efforts. You begin with the collar, laid flat and pressed from the points inward to avoid creasing the tips. Then the yoke, that small panel of fabric across the shoulders, worked over the narrow end of the board where the curve of it can lie properly flat. Then the sleeves, each one laid out individually, the seam aligned precisely down the underside, so the crease that forms falls exactly where a crease should fall and nowhere else, a detail that Dottie has come to believe separates a shirt that looks merely clean from one that looks genuinely well kept. Then the body of the shirt itself, worked in sections, the iron moving in long, even strokes that carry a faint hiss of steam, and the specific warm, slightly scorched smell of hot cotton that Dottie associates, without ever quite articulating it to herself, with the particular satisfaction of a task done properly. She irons 3 shirts this Monday afternoon, plus a blouse of her own and 2 of Susan's small cotton dresses, working steadily while the radio, moved now from the kitchen counter to a spot where she can hear it over the hiss of the iron, plays through a stretch of music interspersed with a woman's voice offering household tips between songs, suggestions about removing grass stains and the proper way to store woolens for the coming winter, information Dottie absorbs half-consciously, filing certain pieces away for later use and letting the rest pass by unremembered, the way you do with most things you hear on the radio during the middle of an ordinary Monday. By noon the ironing is done, the shirts hung on wire hangers from a hook on the utility room door, and Dottie makes lunch for herself and Susan, a simple affair of soup from a can, tomato, warmed on the stove and served with crackers, and a glass of milk for Susan, who eats with the particular seriousness small children bring to a meal they have not had to wait very long for. Dottie eats standing up, more often than not, at the counter rather than the table, a habit she has never fully examined, but that seems to belong to some unspoken category of things a woman does when there is no one else present to make the meal feel like an occasion. It is not sad exactly, it is simply efficient, and efficiency, on a day like this one, matters more to her than ceremony. After lunch comes the part of the day given over to errands, and today that means a trip to the grocery store, a supermarket really, one of the new self-service kind that has replaced in the space of just a few years the older model of a clerk behind a counter fetching items one at a time from shelves behind him. Dottie finds this new arrangement, wheeling a metal cart herself down wide aisles, selecting items directly from open shelves, still faintly novel and genuinely convenient, though her mother, on a visit last spring, pronounced the whole system somewhat undignified, as though shopping without a clerk's assistance amounted to doing the man's job for him. She takes Susan along, settled into the child's seat built into the front of the cart, and the store itself, when they arrive, is a bright humming space, fluorescent lighting overhead casting everything in a flat, even white, that makes the produce look almost unnaturally vivid. Stacks of oranges and apples arranged in pyramids that a stock boy has clearly spent real effort building. The meat counter runs along the back wall, staffed by a butcher in a white apron who Dottie has come to know well enough over the past 2 years to trade a few words with most weeks, and today she asks him for a chuck roast, something that will do for Sunday, and a £1.50 of ground beef for a meatloaf later in the week, both wrapped in white paper and tied with string, the price marked in grease pencil on the outside. The cart fills gradually as she moves through the store with a list written that morning on the back of an envelope, a list organised roughly by the store's own layout, since she has walked these aisles often enough to know their order without thinking about it. A box of cereal for the children's breakfasts, a bag of flour, a can of coffee, a dozen eggs, a bottle of milk, though they still get most of their milk delivered. This is simply for emergencies between deliveries. A box of gelatin dessert in a flavour Susan requests, with the specific, unwavering conviction of a 5-year-old who has decided, for reasons known only to herself, that this particular shade of red is the only acceptable one. There is a whole section of the store devoted to what the industry has started calling convenience foods, and Dottie pauses here longer than she probably needs to, examining a can of prepared spaghetti and a box that promises a complete casserole in under 30 minutes, with the addition of only a can of soup and some ground meat. She does not buy either one today, not out of any particular disapproval, but because Walter has opinions about canned pasta that she has learned, over the years, are not worth arguing against for the sake of one weeknight dinner. Still, she notices the products, files them away the way she files away radio tips, aware in some general sense that the whole texture of cooking is shifting under her feet, faster than she has quite had time to notice, and that the daughters of women her age will likely grow up in kitchens that look, in certain respects, almost unrecognizable compared to her own. At the checkout, a young woman not much older than Dottie herself rings up the total on a mechanical register, the numbers appearing in a small window with a satisfying metallic click for each entry, and bags the groceries into paper sacks with the quick, practiced motions of someone who has done this several hundred times already this week alone. The total comes to just over $11, a figure Dottie notes with the automatic mental accounting she performs on nearly every purchase, weighing it against the household budget she keeps in a small ledger at home, a habit her own mother taught her, and one she has never once considered abandoning, regardless of how thoroughly Walter trusts her with the money, which he does, completely, a trust she takes seriously enough to have never once given him cause to reconsider it. The drive home takes 6 minutes. Susan chattering from the back seat about something a girl down the street said regarding a dog that may or may not actually exist, and by the time they pull back into the driveway, the early afternoon has settled into the particular quality of light that this house seems to hold especially well, warm and a little golden, falling across the still mostly bare dirt of the backyard where the sod has not yet taken, and across the young maple tree, its wire stakes catching the light in thin bright lines. This is, if you were to ask Dottie to name it, probably her favourite hour of the day, though she would likely feel a small twinge of guilt admitting it. Susan goes down for a nap most afternoons around 1:30, worn out from the morning's activity and lulled, more often than not, by a story read aloud in the rocking chair by her bed, a chair Dottie's father made as a wedding gift, and that has, over the past 5 years, become genuinely worn smooth in the places where 2 generations of small children have gripped its arms while listening to stories. And once Susan is down, once the house has gone properly quiet, Dottie has, for perhaps an hour, sometimes closer to 2 if the nap runs long, something that does not quite have a name in the vocabulary available to her, but that functions, in every practical sense, as time entirely her own. What she does with this hour varies. Some afternoons she sits at the small desk in the corner of the living room, a modest piece of furniture with a drop front that conceals a stack of stationery and the household ledger, and writes letters, to her mother mostly, sometimes to a college friend who moved to California 2 years ago, and whose letters back are full of descriptions of orange trees and a climate Dottie finds almost impossible to properly picture. Other afternoons she reads a novel currently sitting on the arm of the sofa with a bookmark tucked about 2/3 of the way through, a story about a family in post-war England that she picked up at the lending library downtown and that she finds herself thinking about at odd moments during the rest of her day, wondering what will happen to a character whose situation does not resemble her own life very closely at all, which is, if she is honest, most of the pleasure of it. The living room itself deserves a moment of attention, since we have moved through it several times now without properly looking around. It is the largest room in the house, running along the front, with a picture window facing the street that lets in a wide rectangle of afternoon light. The furniture is a matched set purchased on installment 2 years ago, a sofa and 2 armchairs upholstered in a nubby fabric the colour of oatmeal, arranged around a low coffee table with a boomerang-shaped glass top, and against one wall stands the piece of furniture that has in the past year quietly become the room's true centre of gravity, a wooden cabinet housing a television set with a screen that seems, to anyone visiting from even 5 years earlier, almost impossibly large. Dottie does not turn the television on during these afternoon hours. That feels to her like something reserved for evening, for family time, a small treat kept for later rather than spent early, the way you might save the good chocolates for after supper. Instead, on afternoons when she is not reading or writing letters, she sometimes simply sits, coffee cooling beside her, and looks out the picture window at the quiet street, watching the particular stillness of a suburban afternoon in a neighborhood built almost entirely around the rhythms of people who are, at this hour, either at work or at school, or, like her, briefly and pleasantly alone in a house built for exactly this kind of pause. There is a specific sound that belongs to these hours, one that I think about often when I picture this particular slice of the past. It is not silence exactly, because there is always something, a lawnmower 2 streets over, the particular hum of the refrigerator compressor cycling on and off, occasionally the distant bell of an ice cream truck making its slow circuit through the neighborhood, still an hour or more from actually passing this street. It is a kind of stillness that modern life, with its constant low hum of notification and connection, has largely misplaced, a stretch of unstructured, unmonitored time that Dottie has learned, gradually, to treasure. Sometimes, on these quiet afternoons, she lets her mind wander back to the year before she married Walter, when she worked at the insurance office downtown, and discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was genuinely quick with the filing system and sharper with numbers than most of the men in the accounting department, a fact her supervisor mentioned more than once with what she took, at the time, as real admiration. She does not dwell on it exactly. It is simply a pleasant thread of memory that surfaces now and then, the way an old song might, and she follows it for a few minutes before setting it gently aside and returning to whatever page she was on. I find myself genuinely fond of this particular stretch of the day, out of everything we have walked through so far. There is something quietly lovely about a life that has, built directly into its structure, an hour or two that belongs to absolutely no one but yourself, no schedule, no small voice calling for you, nothing but a book, a window, and the soft, ordinary sounds of an early afternoon settling comfortably around you. At 2:30, the quiet ends, gently, the way it began. Susan wakes from her nap, with the particular disoriented softness of a small child surfacing from sleep, calling out for her mother in a voice still thick with dreams, and Dottie goes to her, and the second half of the afternoon begins. Tommy comes through the front door a little after 3:30, dropping his satchel by the entryway, in a spot his mother has asked him, probably 100 times by now, not to drop it, and heading straight for the kitchen with the specific hunger of an 8-year-old who considers lunch to have happened roughly a geological age ago. Dottie has a small snack ready most days. Today it is graham crackers with a glass of milk, and Tommy eats standing at the counter, already narrating some incident from the school playground involving a kickball and a boy named Ronald, whose account of events Tommy finds deeply, personally unjust. This particular hour of the afternoon has a texture all its own on this street, one that repeats itself, with small variations, on nearly every fair weather day. Once snacks are dispatched, the neighborhood children reconvene outside with an informality that would strike a later generation as almost radical. No scheduled activities, no supervising adults stationed nearby, simply a loose agreement, worked out somewhere among the children themselves, about which yard or which stretch of sidewalk today's game will occupy. Tommy heads out with his glove, meeting up with the same two boys from the corner, plus a third from 2 streets over, and the 4 of them spend the better part of an hour throwing a ball back and forth in the side yard, with the particular seriousness boys that age bring to an activity that has no scoreboard and no real stakes beyond their own private sense of who has the better arm. Susan, meanwhile, is drawn into an equally loose gathering of younger children a few doors down, centered this afternoon around a game involving a length of chalk and the smooth concrete of a neighbor's driveway, the specific rules of which shift constantly according to negotiations conducted entirely among 5- and 6-year-olds, and understood by absolutely no adult who might happen to observe them. Dottie can see most of this activity from her own front step, or hear it at least, the particular pitch of children's voices carrying easily on a still afternoon, and she moves between kitchen and porch every so often, present without hovering, a form of supervision so light it barely registers as supervision at all. This is, I think, one of the details about this particular era and this particular kind of neighborhood that people find themselves genuinely moved by when they picture it properly, and I count myself among them. The sheer number of children on a street like this one, all roughly the same age, all attending the same school, all more or less free to wander between yards and sidewalks, with a degree of independence that would seem almost unthinkable only a couple of decades later, created a specific kind of childhood that existed for perhaps one generation and then, quietly, began to fade. Not better or worse necessarily than what came before or after, just specific to this moment, this street, this particular arrangement of new houses filled with new families all raising children at roughly the same time. Around 4:30, Dottie's attention turns fully toward dinner, and this is where the day's rhythm shifts again, gathering itself toward the evening's main event. She has decided, somewhere over the course of the afternoon without quite consciously deciding, on pork chops tonight, purchased 2 days ago and kept in the refrigerator's meat drawer, paired with mashed potatoes and a can of green beans that will be dressed up with a bit of bacon fat and a pinch of sugar, a small trick her mother taught her that makes canned vegetables taste, if not exactly fresh, at least considerably less like the inside of a tin. The kitchen at this hour becomes genuinely busy in a way the rest of the day has not quite matched. Potatoes are peeled at the sink, the peeler moving in long practice strokes that leave a curling ribbon of skin dropping into a bowl set beneath for exactly this purpose, then quartered and set to boil in a pot on the back burner. The pork chops are seasoned simply, salt and pepper and a light dredge of flour, and set aside on a plate while the skillet heats on the front burner, a cast-iron pan that belonged to Walter's grandmother and that Dottie has come to regard, after several years of cooking on it, as possessing something close to an actual personality, temperamental in certain ways, reliably excellent in others. The chops go into the hot skillet with a sound that fills the whole kitchen, a sharp, satisfying sizzle that Dottie has always found strangely encouraging, a sound that means something is properly underway. She works efficiently from here, moving between the skillet, the potato pot, and the can opener mounted on the wall by the counter, a small mechanical device that Walter installed himself last summer and that still, months later, gives Dottie a small flicker of satisfaction every time she uses it, the way any well-designed tool tends to please a person who values things that work the way they are supposed to. Let us slow down here for just a moment, because I want to point out something about this kitchen at this hour that is easy to overlook. What Dottie is doing right now, and what women very much like her are doing in kitchens up and down this street and 1,000 streets just like it, all at roughly the same hour, all cooking a dinner that will be ready within a narrow, unspoken window around the time their husbands walk through the door. This synchronization, this precise national choreography of dinner timed to the workday's end, was itself a relatively recent invention, built out of train schedules and office hours and radio programming that had over the preceding decades gradually trained an entire country's stomach to expect its evening meal at roughly 6 o'clock, give or take a half hour depending on region. It is not natural. It is not the way people have always eaten. It is in its own quiet way a piece of very deliberate social architecture, and Dottie has never once thought about it in these terms, because to her it is simply what time you eat dinner. The mashed potatoes come together with butter and a splash of the milk kept back specifically for this purpose, whipped smooth with a hand masher until they reach the particular texture Walter prefers. Not too loose, not too stiff, a standard Dottie has calibrated over years of small adjustments and minor failures she no longer even remembers as failures, only as steps along the way to getting it right. The green beans simmer in their small pot with the bacon fat and sugar, the gravy comes together in the same skillet the chops cooked in, deglazed with a bit of the pan drippings and a spoonful of flour whisked in against the risk of lumps, and by the time all of this converges, the kitchen smells like something you could probably identify blindfolded from 3 rooms away. Warm and savoury, and just faintly sweet from the beans. Tommy and Susan are called in from outside around 5:45. Both of them flushed and a little breathless from an afternoon of unstructured motion, and there is the familiar small skirmish over hand-washing before dinner, Tommy insisting his hands are clean enough already, an assertion Dottie meets with the specific unhurried patience of someone who has had this exact conversation perhaps 300 times before, and expects to have it 300 more. The sound of the Chevrolet pulling into the driveway arrives at 6:05, and there is a particular shift that happens in the house at this sound. Small but real, a kind of settling, the day's separate strands beginning to gather back into one place. Walter comes through the front door with his hat already in hand, sets his lunch pail on the small table by the entry, and there is a moment, brief but genuinely warm, where Dottie meets him at the door, the way she has most evenings for 6 years, and he tells her, before he has even properly taken off his coat, that traffic on the highway was worse than usual, a complaint that carries, underneath its surface grumbling, a kind of contentment, the specific pleasure of a man returning to a house that is glad to have him back. Susan runs to greet her father with the full unself-conscious enthusiasm of a 5-year-old, and Walter scoops her up briefly before setting her back down, asking Tommy about his day in the particular economical way fathers of this era tend to ask, a question that expects and receives a fairly brief answer before the conversation moves on to whatever Walter himself wants to discuss, which tonight is mostly a complaint about a colleague named Edmund who has, in Walter's account, taken credit for an idea that was substantially Walter's own. Dinner is served at the kitchen table promptly at 6:15, the same table where breakfast happened some 10 hours earlier, now bearing an entirely different meal and an entirely different quality of light, the gold of morning replaced by the softer, more golden orange of early evening slanting through the window over the sink. The family eats together, all 4 of them, a fact that would have seemed entirely unremarkable to everyone at this table, but that later generations would come to regard as something worth deliberately preserving, a nightly gathering that this household simply takes for granted as the ordinary shape of an evening. Dinner conversation moves in its familiar channels. Walter asks about the day in general terms, receives Dottie's brief account of the laundry and the grocery trip, and Susan's ongoing negotiations with the neighborhood chalk game, and offers in turn a slightly more detailed account of his own day, the Henderson account, the business with Edmund, a passing mention of a memo about office parking that has apparently generated more discussion among the men at his firm than the actual substance of the memo would seem to warrant. Tommy interjects periodically with baseball statistics that only tangentially relate to whatever else is being discussed, and Susan, midway through the meal, announces with great solemnity that she intends to be a fireman when she grows up, a declaration that Walter receives with entirely appropriate gravity, asking several genuinely thoughtful follow-up questions about which particular aspects of firefighting appeal to her most. There is a specific pleasure in a scene like this one that is worth naming plainly, because it would be easy to rush past it in search of something more dramatic. Nothing remarkable happens at this table tonight. Nobody announces a piece of important news. There is no argument, no revelation, nothing that a person watching from outside would think to remark upon. And yet this ordinary half-hour, 4 people eating pork chops and mashed potatoes under a kitchen light while the evening settles in blue and gold outside the window, represents something that an enormous amount of the day's earlier effort was quietly organized around producing. The laundry, the ironing, the grocery trip, all of it converges here, in this unremarkable, comfortable half-hour, and there is something almost moving in that, once you notice it. After the meal, the division of labor that governs this household reasserts itself along familiar lines. Walter retreats to the living room with the evening paper, a second edition that arrived sometime during the afternoon, and that he reads more thoroughly than the morning copy, since he has, in the evening, the leisure of an actual armchair rather than a breakfast table shared with 2 children. Tommy is dispatched to the bathroom for his own wash-up, and Susan trails after her mother into the kitchen, where the dishes wait, and where Susan has recently been promoted to the genuinely important job of drying, a task she takes with tremendous seriousness despite a drying technique that leaves most plates nearly as wet as when she started. The kitchen at this hour has its own particular character, softer somehow than the busy efficiency of dinner preparation an hour earlier. Dottie washes at the sink, the water hot enough to leave her hands faintly pink, working through the stack of dinner dishes with the same unhurried competence she has brought to nearly every task today, while Susan dries beside her on a step stool that brings her just tall enough to reach the counter properly, chattering about a fireman's helmet she has apparently decided she requires by Christmas. The radio plays again from its spot on the counter, tuned now to an evening program of music rather than the daytime mix of talk and advertisement, and the 2 of them work through the dishes to its accompaniment, a small quiet duet performed most evenings of the week without either of them ever thinking to describe it in such terms. By 7, the kitchen is clean, the dishes stacked in the drainer to finish drying overnight, the counters wiped down, the stove's enamel surface given a final polish with a damp cloth, a habit Dottie maintains with a consistency that borders on the ceremonial, a way of formally closing the kitchen's business for the day before the household moves fully into its evening. There is one more small pocket of this evening worth returning to before we let the house finish settling into sleep. A short stretch of time between the dinner dishes and the television program that we moved past rather quickly earlier, because Tommy, most weeknights, has a small amount of homework to finish, and tonight is no exception. He works at the kitchen table, the same table that held breakfast and dinner both, now cleared and wiped and holding nothing but a single sheet of arithmetic problems Miss Halloran assigned that afternoon, a pencil, and Tommy himself, seated with the specific restless posture of an 8-year-old boy who would rather be doing almost anything else, but who has, to his credit, developed enough of a work ethic around numbers specifically that this particular homework rarely turns into the kind of protracted negotiation that, say, an assigned reading passage might provoke instead. Dottie sits with him for these 15 or 20 minutes most evenings, not directly helping, since the problems themselves rarely require it, but present nonetheless, working on her own small task alongside him. Tonight it happens to be addressing an envelope for the letter she plans to finish writing to her mother tomorrow, the 2 of them sharing the table in a companionable quiet, broken only by the occasional scratch of pencil on paper and Tommy's periodic muttered arithmetic under his breath. 7 and 6, that's 13, carry the 1. This particular habit, sitting together at homework time even when direct help is not strictly necessary, is one Dottie adopted somewhat deliberately, having read an article in a parenting magazine some years back, suggesting that a child's attitude towards schoolwork is shaped less by direct instruction and more by simple, consistent parental presence during the actual work itself, a small piece of advice that struck her, at the time, as sensible enough to actually implement, and that she has, in the years since, come to believe genuinely was. Behind Tommy, along the wall of the dining area that adjoins the kitchen, stands a modest bookshelf. 3 shelves of books that represent, collectively, the household's entire library, a mixture of practical volumes, a cookbook Dottie consults regularly, a household repair manual Walter references considerably less often than he probably should, a handful of novels Dottie has worked through over the past several years, and, occupying the bottom shelf almost entirely on its own, a full set of encyclopedias purchased 2 years ago from a travelling salesman who spent the better part of an evening in this very living room making his case to Walter, a set Walter agreed to more out of a general, somewhat vague conviction that a household with growing children ought to have one than out of any specific plan for how it would actually be used. That conviction, as it turns out, was not misplaced. Tommy has developed, over the past year in particular, a genuine habit of pulling a volume down at random on slow afternoons, flipping through entries about distant countries or extinct animals, or the mechanics of steam engines, with a curiosity that neither Walter nor Dottie specifically cultivated, but that both find quietly gratifying to observe, a small, unplanned return on an investment that felt, at the time of purchase, like a fairly significant one. The full set, having cost nearly $70, paid off across an installment plan, not unlike the one still retiring the television's purchase price. Tonight, homework finished and checked over briefly by Dottie more out of habit than genuine necessity, Tommy pushes back from the table with the particular relief of a task completed, and the kitchen empties out toward the living room, where Walter has already settled into his armchair, and the television waits, unlit for the moment, in its wooden cabinet, the evening's next chapter, the one we have already walked through together, about to properly begin. The evening, once the kitchen work is finished, belongs to the living room, and increasingly, in this particular household, as in so many others across the country this year, it belongs specifically to the television set, housed in its wooden cabinet against the far wall. Walter has already claimed his armchair by the time Dottie and the children join him, paper folded and set aside on the small table beside it, and there is a brief, mildly ceremonial process of turning the set on, a warm-up period of perhaps 30 seconds during which the tubes inside gather themselves toward readiness, a faint hum building until the screen resolves from grey static into a picture, black and white and slightly soft around the edges by later standards, but genuinely marvellous by the standards of anyone who remembers a living room without one. Tonight's programming, worked out in advance by the newspaper's television listings that Dottie checked earlier in the day, includes a variety program at 7:30 featuring a rotating cast of singers and comedians performing live, an experience that still carries, for this family as for most, a specific kind of wonder, the knowledge that the performance happening on this small glowing screen is occurring at this very moment, somewhere far away, transmitted invisibly through the air and gathered by the antenna mounted on the roof, itself a small marvel Walter installed with considerable pride and a not insignificant amount of difficulty, involving a ladder and several hours of adjusting its angle, while Dottie called encouragement, or occasionally discouragement, from an upstairs window. Susan sits on the floor close to the screen, closer than her mother generally allows but tonight permits, cross-legged on the braided rug that anchors the seating arrangement, entirely absorbed in a song and dance number featuring a woman in a sequin dress who Susan has decided, with the total conviction of a 5-year-old, is the most beautiful person she has ever personally witnessed. Tommy sits on the sofa beside his mother, more restless than his sister, periodically narrating his own commentary on the program, that nobody has specifically requested, but that everyone tolerates with a particular fondness families reserve for their children's unnecessary but harmless observations. Here is something worth pausing on, one of those small threads I mentioned earlier, that I want to leave a little open rather than tie up too neatly. This television set, purchased just over a year ago on an installment plan that will not be fully paid off for another 8 months, has changed the shape of this family's evenings in ways that none of them have really stopped to articulate. A year ago, this same hour would likely have found them gathered around the radio instead, listening to a program rather than watching one, and the difference between those two experiences, listening together versus watching together, is subtler than it might first appear, and also, I think, genuinely significant, though exactly how it is significant is something this family, and honestly this whole country, is still in the process of figuring out. Around 8:30, the variety program gives way to a half-hour comedy that Walter particularly enjoys, following the exploits of a suburban family not entirely unlike this one, headed by a bumbling but well-meaning father whose small domestic missteps are resolved, week after week, within the tidy confines of 22 minutes plus advertisements. Walter laughs at this program more openly than at almost anything else in his week, a genuine, unguarded sound that Dottie finds, even after 6 years of marriage, quietly endearing, a glimpse of the easier, less burdened version of him that emerges specifically in these relaxed evening hours. By 9, Susan's attention has begun to flag, her small body sinking gradually sideways against the arm of the sofa in the particular boneless way of a child fighting sleep and losing. Dottie catches this moment with the practiced eye of someone who has watched it happen perhaps 1,000 times before, and announces, with a gentleness that nonetheless leaves no real room for negotiation, that it is time for bed. Bath night, properly speaking, falls on Wednesdays and Saturdays in this household, a schedule that reflects both the practical labour involved in heating enough water for 2 children's baths and a general unexamined belief, common enough at the time, that a nightly full bath was somewhat excessive for children who were not, after all, especially dirty on an ordinary Monday. Tonight then is simply a wash-up, hands and face and teeth, conducted at the pink-tiled sink with a washcloth and a bar of ivory soap that Susan insists on smelling before every single use, a small private ritual her mother has stopped questioning. Tommy manages his own wash-up now, a recent development that fills him with visible pride, though Dottie still checks his neck and ears afterward, with a discretion calculated not to embarrass an 8-year-old who considers himself substantially grown. Susan requires more direct assistance, standing on a small wooden step stool in front of the sink, while her mother works a soapy cloth over her face with the particular gentle firmness of someone who has learnt, through experience, exactly how much pressure a 5-year-old will tolerate before objecting. Pajamas come next. Tommy's a cotton set printed with a pattern of small red airplanes that Dottie ordered from a catalogue last winter. Susan's a matching nightgown and robe in pale pink flannel, soft from repeated washing, that Dottie made herself on the sewing machine that lives folded into a cabinet in the corner of the bedroom, a skill she inherited from her own mother and takes real quiet pride in, though it is not a skill anyone outside the household particularly notices or comments on. Tommy's bedtime, at 8, is now negotiated with a degree of resistance that increases steadily with each passing month, a small ongoing campaign for extra minutes that Dottie manages with a mixture of firmness and, occasionally, genuine amusement at the increasingly sophisticated arguments her son constructs in favor of staying up later. Tonight's version involves an elaborate case for why one additional chapter of the book they are currently reading together, an adventure story involving a boy detective, constitutes a reasonable request, given that the previous chapter ended, in Tommy's words, at an extremely unfair place to stop. Dottie relents, as she often does, and reads the requested chapter aloud, sitting on the edge of Tommy's bed with the lamp on his nightstand, casting a warm circle of light across the pennant above his headboard and the baseball glove still sitting on the dresser where he left it that morning. Her reading voice has a particular quality that Tommy would probably struggle to name if asked. Unhurried, warm, with small variations for different characters that are not especially skilled impressions, but that Tommy has never once thought to critique, simply accepting them as the correct and only way this particular story could possibly sound. Susan's bedtime happens simultaneously, in the smaller room across the hall, handled tonight by Walter, who has taken over the task of putting Susan down perhaps 3 nights out of 7 since she was old enough to have a preference about it, a preference that currently and firmly favours her father over her mother for this particular ritual, a fact Dottie has decided not to take personally and mostly succeeds. Walter sits in the small rocking chair beside Susan's bed, the rabbit tucked under one of her arms, and recites, from memory at this point, a story he has told perhaps 200 times about a fictional adventure he had as a boy, involving a fishing trip and a fish so large it required, in the telling, an ever-escalating series of embellishments that Susan has come to expect and specifically requests by name. There is a prayer said together, a short and simple one that both children learnt before they could properly talk, thanking God for the day and asking for good dreams and for blessings on the various people in their lives, a list that changes slightly depending on Susan's current preoccupations, and tonight includes, alongside her parents and brother and grandparents, a specific mention of the dog she does not actually have but has been petitioning for, with escalating seriousness for several months. By 8:30, both children are settled, doors left slightly ajar according to household preference, a small nightlight glowing in the hallway between their 2 rooms, and the house, for the second time today, begins to quiet, though this time the quiet has a different quality than the mornings, softer, settled, the particular hush of a home where the day's main business has been concluded, and only the evening's gentler business remains. With the children settled, Walter and Dottie have, most evenings, an hour or so that belongs specifically to the 2 of them, a smaller, quieter echo of the private time Dottie enjoys during Susan's afternoon nap, though this version comes with company rather than solitude, which suits its own particular purpose just as well. Tonight they return to the living room, though the television stays off now, an unspoken household rule that evenings past 9 belong to conversation or reading rather than programming, a rule neither of them has ever stated explicitly, but that both observe with total consistency. Walter settles back into his armchair with a small glass of something amber-coloured, poured from a bottle kept in the cabinet beneath the record player, a modest indulgence he allows himself most weeknights, never more than the one glass, a habit of moderation he picked up from his own father and has never felt any particular urge to abandon. Dotty brings out her mending basket, a wicker container that lives on a shelf in the hall closet and that seems, by some mysterious law of household physics, to never actually empty regardless of how diligently she works through it. Tonight's contents include a shirt of Walter's with a button hanging by a single thread, one of Tommy's play shirts with a small tear at the elbow from an ambitious afternoon involving a fence he was not supposed to climb, and a pair of Susan's socks that need darning at the heel, a skill Dotty's grandmother taught her one summer, and that she still finds, oddly, one of the more satisfying tasks in her entire domestic repertoire, the slow, careful weaving of new thread across a worn patch until the fabric holds again, sturdy and nearly invisible. The record player gets occasional use during these evening hours, and tonight Walter selects an album of orchestral music, nothing especially adventurous, a collection of light classical pieces that neither of them would describe themselves as particularly devoted to, but that both find pleasant enough as a backdrop to an evening of quiet, separate but companionable activity. The needle drops with a small crackle, the first notes emerging warm and slightly imperfect from the speaker built into the cabinet, and the living room settles into the specific, comfortable quiet of two people who have been married long enough to sit together for an hour without needing to fill every minute of it with talk. They do talk, eventually, in the loose, meandering way that characterizes most of their evening conversations, moving from a discussion of whether the Hendersons next door are planning to build a fence, to a brief debate about whether Tommy is old enough yet for a bicycle without training wheels, to Walter's mild, ongoing complaint about a co-worker's habit of scheduling meetings just before lunch, a grievance Dotty has heard several versions of before and receives with the specific, practiced patience of a woman who understands that being heard, rather than solved, is usually what her husband actually wants from these conversations. There is something worth noticing in this hour. Something that does not get said out loud, but that sits underneath the whole scene. This is, in its way, the most equal hour of Dotty and Walter's entire day, the hour least structured by the specific roles that organize everything else, breadwinner and homemaker, provider and manager, a distinction that governs the morning and the afternoon, and most of dinner, but that softens considerably here, in the lamp-lit living room at 9:30, where they are, for this hour at least, simply two people who like each other's company, working through their own small tasks side by side. Around 10, Walter switches off the record player and stretches, a motion that signals, in the household's unspoken language, that the evening is drawing to its close. Dotty folds the last mended item into the basket, sets it back on its shelf, and the two of them move through the house together on a final circuit that has become, over years of repetition, its own small nightly ceremony. Before we move toward the end of this particular day, I want to take a moment to widen the frame a little, because this house does not exist in isolation, and I think the street it sits on deserves its own proper introduction. Maple Terrace, since that is what we decided to call it, curves in a gentle arc from the main road down to a small cul-de-sac at its far end, lined on both sides with houses that are in the way of nearly every subdivision built during this particular boom, variations on a small handful of basic models, staggered and mirrored and painted in different approved colors, specifically to avoid the impression of total uniformity, though the impression persists anyway, faintly, to anyone who drives the length of the street with attention. Walter and Dotty's house sits roughly in the middle of the block, and their immediate neighbors offer a kind of cross-section of the particular life stage this whole street seems to share. To the left, the Hendersons, mentioned earlier in tonight's conversation about the possible fence, a couple perhaps 5 years older than Walter and Dotty, with 3 children instead of 2, the oldest already 12 and showing early signs of the specific restlessness that comes just before adolescence properly arrives. Mr. Henderson works for the same insurance company as Walter. In fact, it was Mr. Henderson who mentioned the opening to Walter in the first place, a small kindness that has anchored a genuine, if not especially deep, friendship between the two households. To the right, a younger couple, married less than 2 years, the Palmers, who moved in only this past spring and are still, in the specific way of new arrivals to a settled block, working out where they fit into the street's existing rhythms. Mrs. Palmer, whose first name is Joan, is expecting their first child sometime around Christmas, a fact that has already prompted several informal conversations on front lawns about hand-me-down items, Dottie having offered, just last week, a box of Susan's old infant clothes that have been sitting in the attic crawl space since Susan outgrew them. Across the street lives a widow, Mrs. Callahan, considerably older than everyone else on the block, having lived in this particular spot since before the subdivision existed at all, in a farmhouse that predates every other structure on the street, and that the builder, for reasons of either sentiment or simple practicality, left standing rather than purchasing and demolishing along with the rest of the original farmland. Mrs. Callahan keeps chickens, a fact that occasionally generates mild, good-natured comment among the newer neighbours, and she has become, without ever quite seeking the role, a kind of unofficial grandmother to half the children on the block, dispensing cookies and mild scoldings with equal generosity to whichever child happens to wander into her yard on a given afternoon. This mixture, a scattering of families all roughly the same age, with children roughly the same ages, plus the occasional older holdout like Mrs. Callahan, plus a steady trickle of newer arrivals like the Palmers, creates a particular social texture that this street shares with thousands of others being built at the same moment across the country, a texture defined above all by a kind of accelerated intimacy. These are, for the most part, people who did not know each other 3 or 4 years ago, who arrived from different cities, different backgrounds, sometimes different regions of the country entirely, and who have been thrown together by nothing more complicated than buying houses within a few hundred feet of each other, and who have in that short window of time built something that functions remarkably like the kind of deep generational community that older towns took decades to develop. Dottie's closest friend on the street, a woman named Marge who lives 4 houses down, fits into this pattern exactly. They met at a meeting of the elementary school's parent association less than 2 years ago, discovered they had both attended, at different times, the same secretarial college in the city, and became, within a matter of months, the kind of friends who telephone each other most mornings simply to discuss nothing in particular, a habit that would have seemed, to either of their own mothers, a somewhat frivolous use of the telephone, an instrument their mother's generation regarded as reserved for genuine necessity rather than ordinary companionship. The telephone itself deserves a small mention here, since it occupies a modest but genuine place in the household's daily rhythm that we have not yet properly touched on tonight. It sits on a small table in the front hallway, a black rotary model in the particular heavy Bakelite that phones of this era are made from, and the line is a party line, shared with 2 other households on the block, a common enough arrangement outside the very centre of town that nobody considers it especially remarkable, though it does require a certain etiquette, listening for the specific ring pattern that indicates the call is actually for this house rather than one of the other 2 sharing the line, and a general, unspoken agreement among all 3 households not to linger too long on any single call during hours when someone else might reasonably need the line for something urgent. Let me back up a few hours now and fill in a piece of the day that we walked right past earlier without properly stopping, because it belongs here in the fuller picture of how a household like this one actually functions, and it involves a whole quiet network of deliveries that arrive at this house over the course of a single day, most of them without anyone in the family ever directly witnessing the moment of arrival. The milkman comes 3 mornings a week, before the household is even properly awake, in a truck that makes a distinctive low rumble Dottie has learned to half-register in her sleep without ever fully waking to it. He leaves glass bottles in the insulated metal box mounted beside the front door, cream still separated at the top the way it always is before homogenization has fully taken over the industry, and takes the empty bottles from yesterday's delivery in exchange, a quiet transaction that requires no signature, no direct interaction most days, simply a standing arrangement built on trust and a monthly bill that arrives, itself, by a different sort of delivery entirely. Mail comes around 11 each morning, carried on foot by a postman named Mr. Riley, who has walked this particular route since the subdivision was new enough that half the houses did not yet have proper mailboxes installed, and who has in that time developed the specific, encyclopedic familiarity with every household on the street that postal workers of this era tend to accumulate almost without meaning to. He knows that the Palmers are expecting a baby because Joan Palmer has recently started receiving a steady stream of mail-order catalogues for infant furnishings. He knows roughly which households receive the most personal correspondence and which mostly get bills, though he would never say so directly to anyone. Today's delivery to Walter and Dottie's house includes the electric bill, a magazine Dottie subscribes to that arrives monthly and that she genuinely looks forward to, and a letter from her mother that she read standing at the kitchen counter sometime around noon, a piece of the day we passed over quickly earlier, but that mattered enough to Dottie that she has been composing, in the back of her mind ever since, a reply she intends to write tomorrow. A newspaper arrives twice a day in this house, the morning edition thrown onto the front step, sometime before 6, by a boy on a bicycle who covers this entire street and 2 others before school, a paper route that earns him a modest weekly sum his mother insists he save half of, and the evening edition, delivered by a different arrangement entirely, picked up by Walter himself from a newsstand near his office and carried home in his coat pocket, since afternoon delivery service does not reliably reach neighborhoods this far from the city center. There is one more visitor worth mentioning from earlier in the day, a detail I find genuinely charming and slightly comic in retrospect. Sometime around 2 in the afternoon, while Susan napped and Dottie sat with her book in the quiet living room, a knock came at the door, and standing on the front step was a young man in a slightly too large suit, a salesman for a well-known brush and household goods company, carrying a leather case of samples and a well-rehearsed opening line about the revolutionary bristle technology of his company's newest vegetable scrub brush. Dottie, who has encountered this particular company's representatives perhaps 6 or 7 times over the past 2 years, ended up buying a small item, a vegetable brush she genuinely did need, less because of the young man's admittedly earnest sales pitch, and more out of a general, neighborhood-wide sense of mild obligation toward door-to-door salesmen who are, after all, simply trying to earn a living, a sentiment Marge shares, and that the 2 of them have discussed more than once over their morning telephone calls. This whole invisible infrastructure, milkman and mailman and paper boy and the occasional traveling salesman, moves through this house and this street constantly, mostly unremarked, a steady, quiet current of goods and information and small human transactions that keeps a household like this one functioning without anyone in it ever having to think very hard about how a bottle of milk gets from a dairy to a doorstep, or how a letter travels from a mother 3 states away to a kitchen counter in time to be read over a bowl of tomato soup. It is worth pulling back for a moment from this single Monday to consider the shape of the whole week that surrounds it, because a day like this one does not exist by itself. It sits inside a rhythm that repeats with only small variations, and understanding that rhythm helps explain why a Monday feels, to Dottie, distinctly like a Monday, rather than simply another day among identical others. Saturday 2 days from now will look almost entirely different. Walter will be home the whole day, and the morning will likely be given over to yard work, mowing the still patchy lawn, perhaps finally getting around to staking the section of sod that arrived last week and has been sitting, somewhat guiltily, in a shaded corner of the yard ever since. There will probably be a trip to the hardware store at some point, a genuine outing that Walter treats with more enthusiasm than the errand itself would seem to warrant, wandering the aisles of tools and fixtures with the particular unhurried pleasure of a man who works with his mind all week and relishes, on Saturdays, the chance to work with his hands instead, even if what his hands actually accomplish is often fairly modest. Saturday afternoons in this household often involve the whole family together in a way weekdays do not allow. Perhaps a drive to a park on the edge of town, or a matinee at the picture house downtown if there is something suitable playing, a treat that costs the 4 of them together not much more than $1, and that Tommy and Susan both anticipate with an eagerness disproportionate to the actual modesty of the outing. Saturday evening sometimes brings company, another couple from the neighborhood over for cards or simply conversation. The children put to bed slightly later than usual, while the adults sit up in the living room with coffee and, depending on the company, perhaps a small glass of something stronger, the record player working through an evening's worth of music, while the conversation ranges from local gossip to national news to, occasionally, nothing at all, simply the comfortable murmur of people who enjoy each other's company. Sunday belongs, in this household as in most on this street, to church, a Methodist congregation whose building sits about a mile from the subdivision, itself relatively new, having been constructed specifically to serve the wave of young families moving into this part of the county over the past several years. The whole family attends together, dressed more formally than any other day of the week, Walter in his good suit, Dottie in a dress reserved specifically for this purpose, the children scrubbed and combed and instructed, with varying degrees of success, in the art of sitting still for an hour. After church, Sunday dinner often brings extended family, Walter's parents most weeks, who live close enough for an easy drive. Occasionally Dottie's when they make the longer trip from 3 states away, a rarer occasion that always involves considerable advance preparation and a meal more elaborate than the household's usual Sunday roast. These gatherings carry their own particular texture, the specific pleasure and mild strain of multiple generations occupying the same modest dining space, Walter's mother offering gentle, unsolicited commentary on Dottie's gravy that Dottie receives with practiced grace, Walter's father entertaining Tommy with stories from his own working days that Tommy finds considerably more compelling than his own father's insurance anecdotes, a fact Walter has noticed and finds more amusing than wounded by. Sunday evening, by contrast, is quiet, almost deliberately so, a kind of collective exhale after the more social portions of the weekend, the television perhaps on for an hour, but the household generally settling early, bracing itself gently for the return of the work week that begins again on Monday morning, with the alarm clock and the percolator and the whole cycle beginning once more, a rhythm this family has settled into so completely that none of them experience it as repetition so much as simply the natural shape of a life, the way a river does not experience its own bends as repetition either, only as the particular, familiar course it has always run. Let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to tell you a little about how a street like Maple Terrace came to exist in the first place, since the story behind it is, I think, genuinely worth knowing, and it explains a good deal about why this particular day feels the way it does. 5 years ago, this land was farmland, part of a larger tract that had been worked by the same family for the better part of a century before the owner, an elderly man with no children interested in continuing the operation, sold the whole parcel to a development company that had been buying up similar tracts on the edges of nearly every American city with a speed that, viewed from a distance, looks almost like a kind of fever. The company surveyed the land, laid out curving streets designed specifically to discourage the kind of fast cut-through traffic that a strict grid pattern tends to invite, and began construction using techniques borrowed, quite directly, from wartime factory production, standardized components, specialized crews who moved from house to house, performing the same single task over and over, rather than a single crew building one house from foundation to roof, a system that allowed houses to rise at a pace that would have seemed, to a builder from even 15 years earlier, almost fantastical. The demand for these houses came from a very specific and very large source, a generation of young men returning from a war that had ended not quite 10 years ago, men who had been promised, as part of the government's broader effort to ease their return to civilian life, access to home loans requiring little or no down payment, a benefit that transformed home ownership from something that had, for most of American history, remained substantially out of reach for ordinary working families, into something that a man in Walter's position, a young insurance clerk with a modest but steady income, could reasonably achieve within just a few years of leaving the service. Walter himself served, briefly, near the very end of the war, a fact he does not discuss often, and that Dottie has learned, over the years, not to press him on beyond whatever he offers voluntarily, which is not much. What he will say, occasionally, usually late in an evening after a second glass of something, is that he came home from that experience with a very specific and very simple set of priorities, a steady job, a family, a house of his own, ambitions that might have seemed modest to a previous generation, but that felt, to men of Walter's specific cohort, like something close to a hard-won reward, a normal, peaceful life they had genuinely wondered, at certain points overseas, whether they would live to actually have. This is one of the threads running quietly underneath this entire street, underneath this entire subdivision, and 1,000 others just like it built during these same few years. Nearly every man on this block is roughly the same age, has a roughly similar wartime story he does not discuss in great detail, and has arrived by roughly the same path at this particular curving street with its particular young trees and its particular new houses. There is something almost architectural about it if you think about it long enough. An entire generation's specific hopes, specific fears, specific hard-won sense of what an ordinary, peaceful life ought to look like, poured quite literally into concrete foundations and framed lumber and pale blue clapboard siding. I find myself genuinely moved by this, the more I sit with it. This house is not simply a house, it is in its way a physical answer to a question an entire generation of young men and women had been asking themselves, consciously or not, through years of rationing and uncertainty and separation. What does an ordinary life actually look like once you are finally allowed to have one again? And the answer, worked out collectively across thousands of streets very much like this one, turned out to look remarkably like this particular kitchen, this particular yard, this particular Monday evening with a pork chop dinner finished and a television glowing softly in the corner of a living room built specifically, deliberately, to hold exactly this kind of ordinary, hard-won peace. Tonight happens to be an evening in early October, which matters more than you might think, because a house like this one wears its seasons differently, and I think it is worth taking a moment to walk through the whole year this house will experience, since the rhythms we have followed today shift meaningfully as the calendar turns. Right now, in these first weeks of autumn, the maple tree in the backyard, still young, still staked against the wind, has begun turning at its edges, a faint rust colour creeping in along the tips of leaves that were solid green just a few weeks ago. The evenings have cooled enough that Dottie has started closing the bedroom window most nights rather than leaving it cracked, and the furnace in the small utility area off the basement stairs, oil-fired, with a thermostat mounted in the hallway that Walter guards with a specific proprietary vigilance, has been tested and readied for the season ahead, though it has not yet needed to run through a full night. Winter, when it arrives in a couple of months, will change the shape of nearly every routine we have walked through tonight. The laundry that hangs so easily on the line this morning will, come January, need to dry indoors on a folding wooden rack set up in the utility room, since a wet sheet left outside in freezing weather simply stiffens into something closer to plywood than fabric. A lesson Dottie learnt the hard way during her very first winter in this house, and has never repeated since. The children's after-school hour, spent today in loose outdoor games with the neighborhood kids, will move indoors, or at most involve a short, bundled expedition to build a snowman in the side yard before frozen fingers send everyone back inside for cocoa. The house itself will feel smaller in winter, cozier in the way a house feels when the whole family is pressed a bit more closely into its heated rooms rather than spreading loosely between house and yard and street. Christmas, when it comes, will transform the living room entirely. A tree set up in the corner near the picture window, strung with lights that Walter untangles every year with a patience that seems to exist nowhere else in his personality. Ornaments unpacked from a box in the attic crawl space that includes, among newer additions, a small handful of pieces that belong to Walter's grandmother, fragile glass things wrapped individually in tissue paper that Dottie handles with a specific, careful reverence each December. Spring arrives, eventually, with its own set of rituals, a thorough house cleaning that goes well beyond the ordinary weekly routine. Windows washed inside and out, curtains taken down and laundered, rugs carried outside and beaten over the clothesline in a cloud of dust that always makes Dottie sneeze and that she nonetheless finds satisfying in a way that is difficult to fully explain. A physical, visible proof that the house has been properly, thoroughly renewed after a long winter shut up against the cold. The garden, such as it is, a small vegetable patch along the side fence that Walter maintains with more enthusiasm than skill, gets turned over and planted sometime in April, tomatoes and beans and a row of marigolds that Dottie requested specifically because she read somewhere that they discourage certain garden pests, a claim Walter regards with polite skepticism but has never bothered to actually test. And summer, when it finally arrives in full, changes the whole texture of daily life on this street in ways that might be the most dramatic seasonal shift of all. The children are out of school entirely, their days stretching long and loosely structured from breakfast until the streetlights come on, itself an unofficial but universally understood signal among every child on the block that it is time to head home. There will be a wading pool in the backyard some afternoons, a hose turned on for impromptu sprinkler games, evenings spent on the front porch rather than in the living room, watching fireflies begin their slow blinking arrival in the deepening dusk, while the adults of the street drift, informally, from yard to yard for a few minutes of conversation, iced tea in hand, before the whole neighborhood gradually turns in for the night. I mention all of this not to rush past tonight. This particular October evening we have been sitting inside for the past hour or so, but because I think it helps to understand that this one day, ordinary as it has been, is itself only a single frame in a much longer reel, one that repeats and shifts and repeats again, season after season, year after year, this same house holding this same family through an entire cycle of American weather and American holidays and American ordinary life, each season bringing its own small variations on a rhythm that, underneath all of it, stays remarkably, comfortingly the same. Let me tell you about how that television set in the living room actually came to be there, because the story of its arrival, just over a year ago now, is one of those small household legends that gets retold often enough in this family to have taken on a settled, polished shape the way a stone smooths after enough handling. Walter had been wanting one for the better part of 2 years before it finally happened, ever since a visit to his brother's house in the city, where a set had been installed the previous Christmas, and where Walter spent the better part of an evening watching a boxing match with an attention so total that Dottie, present for the same visit, later described it as watching a man fall quietly, completely in love. He raised the subject periodically after that, in the careful, strategic way he raises most significant purchases, mentioning a friend from the office who had gotten one, mentioning a sale advertised in the paper, planting the idea and letting it sit rather than pressing it directly, a negotiating style Dottie has come to recognize so well after 6 years of marriage that she generally knows what he actually wants roughly 2 months before he finally works up to actually asking for it. The actual purchase happened on a Saturday in September, the two of them driving downtown together, children left with Walter's mother for the afternoon, to an appliance store with a wide display window full of sets all tuned to the same channel, a small crowd of pedestrians gathered on the sidewalk outside, simply watching through the glass, a form of casual public entertainment that store owners had begun to actively encourage, understanding correctly that nothing sold a television set quite as effectively as the sight of an actual television set already turned on and working. They settled on a model with a 17-inch screen, more than either of them had originally intended to spend. But the salesman, a persuasive man with an easy manner, walked them through a comparison with a smaller and cheaper model in a way that made the larger set feel, by the end of the conversation, less like an indulgence and more like the only sensible choice, a sales technique Walter recognized even as he was falling for it, and that he still, a year later, brings up occasionally with a rueful kind of admiration for how effectively it worked on him. The delivery came the following Tuesday, 2 men carrying the wooden cabinet up the front walk, with the particular careful choreography of people who have done this exact job many times before, and the installation of the roof antenna took place that same afternoon, a process considerably more involved than either Walter or Dottie had anticipated, requiring several trips up and down a borrowed ladder and a fair amount of shouted communication between Walter on the roof and Dottie stationed by the set indoors, calling out whether the picture had improved or worsened with each small adjustment of the antenna's angle. The children's reaction when they came home from school that day was something neither Walter nor Dottie has ever quite managed to fully describe to anyone who was not present for it. Tommy simply stood in front of the glowing screen for what felt like several full minutes without saying a single word, an unusual enough occurrence for an 8-year-old boy that Dottie actually checked his forehead for fever before realizing he was in fact perfectly fine, just thoroughly, completely amazed. Susan, only 4 at the time, approached the set with a mixture of fascination and genuine suspicion, walking around the back of the wooden cabinet at one point to check, apparently, whether there might be tiny people hidden somewhere inside it. That first evening, the whole family sat together in the living room for nearly 3 hours, far past the children's normal bedtime, watching whatever happened to be broadcasting, a program about wildlife, followed by a variety show, followed by the evening news, none of it especially remarkable in retrospect, but all of it received, that particular night, with the total rapt attention that people generally reserve for something they have been quietly wanting for a very long time and have finally at last been given. A year later, the novelty has settled into something closer to ordinary habit, the specific evening ritual we walked through earlier tonight. But Dottie still catches herself, every so often, glancing at the wooden cabinet in the corner of the room and feeling a small flicker of the same astonishment that filled this house on that first September evening, the simple, genuine wonder of a picture and a sound travelling invisibly through the air into her own living room, into this particular house on this particular curving street that did not even exist 5 years ago. Thinking about family, as we have been for the past little while, brings to mind a visit from just this past Sunday, one worth lingering on for a moment, because it shows a side of this household's life that a single Monday, however thoroughly examined, cannot quite capture on its own. Walter's parents arrived a little after church let out, his father driving a sedan a full decade older than Walter's own Chevrolet, and maintained, Walter's father would tell you at considerable length if given the opportunity, with a diligence that has kept it running smoothly, well past the point most men would have traded it in. Walter's father worked, for 31 years, at a manufacturing plant on the other side of the county, retiring only last spring, and the transition from a working life to a retired one has left him, Dottie has noticed, with a specific restless energy that seems to require constant small projects, and Sunday's visit included, among other things, an unrequested but genuinely welcome hour spent fixing a sticking hinge on the garage door that had been irritating Walter for weeks without his ever quite getting around to addressing it himself. Meanwhile, Walter's mother installed herself in the kitchen almost the moment she arrived, a presence Dottie has learnt to receive with a careful balance of genuine gratitude and gentle self-assertion, since her mother-in-law's help comes reliably bundled together with a fair amount of commentary about how things might be done slightly differently. Commentary Dottie absorbs with practiced grace, taking the genuinely useful pieces, an old family trick for keeping gravy from separating, and quietly setting aside the rest, an opinion about the proper thickness for pie crust that Dottie has heard perhaps 30 times now and has decided, with equal parts affection and firmness, simply does not match her own preference. Susan, for her part, adores these visits without any complication whatsoever, following her grandmother around the kitchen with the specific devoted shadow behavior of a 5-year-old convinced that her grandmother possesses genuinely magical culinary powers, an impression Walter's mother does nothing to discourage and in fact actively cultivates, slipping Susan small tastes of things throughout the afternoon with a conspiratorial wink that suggests, without ever quite stating outright, that this particular treat is a secret between the two of them. Never mind that Dottie is standing 3 feet away and can see the entire transaction clearly. Tommy gravitates instead toward his grandfather, the two of them disappearing out to the garage or the side yard for stretches of time that involve, depending on the week, anything from actual minor home repair to entirely fabricated projects invented specifically to give an 8-year-old boy and his grandfather an excuse to spend an hour together talking about nothing in particular while ostensibly fixing something that was not especially broken to begin with. Walter's father tells stories from his own working years during these stretches, tales of factory floor characters and incidents that have, over years of retelling, taken on a burnished, slightly exaggerated quality that Tommy accepts entirely at face value, and that Walter, overhearing occasional fragments from across the yard, recognizes as having grown considerably in the telling since he first heard these same stories as a boy himself. Sunday dinner that week was a roast, Walter's mother's recipe though prepared, this time by Dottie's own hands, a small ongoing negotiation of culinary territory that both women handle with more grace than either might initially receive credit for. The table that day held 6 instead of the usual 4, conversation looping easily between several separate threads at once, Walter's father discussing a piece of county politics with genuine interest, Walter's mother asking Dottie detailed questions about Susan's upcoming kindergarten enrollment, Tommy recounting, with his grandfather's enthusiastic encouragement, a heavily embellished version of that garage hinge repair that made it sound considerably more dramatic and technically impressive than the actual event had been. There is a particular warmth in a gathering like this one, a warmth that does not really belong to any single person at the table, but seems to emerge from the specific combination of all of them together. 3 generations occupying one modest dining room, passing dishes and stories back and forth across a table that was, just one day earlier, hosting nothing more elaborate than pork chops and a quiet Monday conversation about office parking memos. I think that contrast is worth sitting with for a moment, the way the exact same table, the exact same chairs, the exact same modest dining room can hold such different textures of family life depending on which day of the week you happen to find it on. I want to spend a little time now on something that runs quietly underneath every single thing we have talked about tonight. Something that rarely gets discussed directly in this household, but that shapes nearly every decision made inside it, and that is the household budget, the actual numbers behind this particular version of an ordinary American life. Walter's salary as a claims processor at the insurance company downtown comes to just under $5,000 a year, a figure that places this household comfortably within the broad middle of the country's income distribution for this particular year, neither poor by any reasonable measure nor especially wealthy, simply solidly, unremarkably average, which is, in its own way, precisely the point of a life like this one. The mortgage on the house runs to about $62 a month, a manageable sum against Walter's income that nonetheless requires the kind of careful, ongoing attention that Dottie brings to it through the small leather ledger she keeps in the drop front desk in the living room, a book that records, in her own neat, careful handwriting, every dollar that moves through this household across the course of a month. She sits down with this ledger most Sunday evenings, after the children are in bed and before the week properly begins, tallying the week's grocery expenses against the allotted budget, noting the mortgage payment due at the start of each month, tracking a small savings account that grows slowly but steadily toward a specific goal the two of them discussed just last month, a proper family vacation next summer, something neither of them experienced much of growing up during the leaner years of their own childhoods, and something they have both quietly decided matters enough to save for deliberately rather than simply hoping it happens. The specific costs of an ordinary week, when you actually sit and add them up the way Dottie does, tell their own small story about this particular moment in American life. A dozen eggs runs about 60 cents. A pound of coffee, a full $1, a price Dottie notes with mild but genuine annoyance, since she remembers it costing considerably less just a couple of years ago. The pork chops served tonight cost about $1 for the £1.50 she bought, the chuck roast waiting in the refrigerator for Sunday closer to $1.50. Walter's suits, purchased perhaps once every year or two, run to around $40 each, a significant enough expense that the decision to buy a new one is never made lightly, and Dottie's own wardrobe, modest by any standard, receives even more careful budgeting, most of her dresses either sewn at home on the machine tucked into the bedroom cabinet, or purchased on sale from the same department store downtown where she and Walter bought the television. There is a specific, quiet competence in how Dottie manages all of this, a skill that receives essentially no formal recognition anywhere in the wider culture around her, but that represents in its own right a genuine and considerable expertise. She has never taken a single course in household economics, never studied accounting beyond what she picked up during her brief working years at the insurance office, and yet she runs with real precision what amounts to a small operating business, allocating a fixed and finite income across housing, food, clothing, savings, and the 100 smaller expenses that a household of 4 generates in the ordinary course of a month, doing all of it with a mental and written accounting so accurate that Walter, who handles considerably larger sums in his professional life, genuinely defers to her judgment on nearly every domestic financial question without a second thought. The insurance policies themselves are worth a small mention here too, since Walter's own profession makes this household somewhat more attentive to the subject than most of their neighbors. There is a life insurance policy on Walter, a modest one, purchased shortly after Tommy was born and increased slightly after Susan arrived, a quiet piece of financial architecture that neither of them discusses often, but that both understand represents a specific kind of care, a hedge against a possibility neither of them likes to dwell on, but that Walter, professionally, understands better than most men his age to be a real, if statistically unlikely, feature of any ordinary life. There is also, tucked into the same drop-front desk as the household ledger, a folder of documents related to the GI loan that made this house possible in the first place, papers Walter reviews perhaps once or twice a year, mostly out of a kind of quiet, ongoing gratitude rather than any actual necessity, a reminder of the specific piece of government policy that transformed a young insurance clerk's modest income into an actual house on an actual street, a transformation that Walter, on reflective evenings, sometimes remarks upon with a genuine, uncomplicated appreciation for the specific, fortunate timing of his own life, arriving home from a war just as an entire national apparatus had been constructed, almost accidentally, to help men exactly like him build exactly this kind of ordinary, comfortable existence. There is one more room in this house we have walked past several times tonight without ever properly stepping inside. A narrow pantry just off the kitchen, shelved floor to ceiling, that deserves a few minutes of attention because it holds, in its own quiet way, some of the most physically demanding work Dottie does across the entire year, even if none of it happens to fall on this particular October Monday. The shelves themselves hold the ordinary staples of a household like this one: flour and sugar in tin canisters, a row of spice jars Dottie has labelled in her own careful handwriting, boxes of gelatin dessert in the specific shade of red Susan favours, and, occupying the lower shelves in neat, gleaming rows, jars of preserves that Dottie put up herself just a few weeks ago, back at the very end of summer, when the last of the season's tomatoes and green beans and a modest crop of peaches from a tree at Walter's parents' house all seemed to ripen at once, demanding attention before the first real cold arrived and put an end to the growing season entirely. Canning Day, or more accurately canning days, since the work generally spreads across the better part of a week each September, ranks among the most physically taxing tasks in Dottie's entire domestic calendar, considerably more demanding than even the most ambitious laundry day, and she approaches it each year with a mixture of genuine dread and genuine satisfaction that she has never quite managed to fully reconcile. The kitchen for those few days transforms into something closer to a small factory floor, pots of boiling water lined up across the stove, a specific rhythm of washing, cutting, packing jars, and processing them in a hot water bath for the precise number of minutes each particular food requires, tomatoes needing less time than green beans, which carry a higher risk of spoilage if not processed thoroughly enough, a fact Dottie learnt from her own mother, along with a healthy, specific fear of a condition called botulism, that neither of them fully understands in any scientific sense, but that both take with total, uncompromising seriousness. The heat alone makes canning day memorable, the kitchen climbing to a temperature that makes even October's mild afternoons feel like a genuine relief by comparison. Dottie working through the process in a house dress soaked through by mid-afternoon, hair escaping its pins in damp strands around her face, the whole kitchen filled with the specific thick sweetness of peaches cooking down, and the sharper, more acidic smell of tomatoes reducing in their own juice. Susan, too young this year to help with anything beyond washing the smaller vegetables, mostly stayed out from underfoot during these particular days, occupied instead by Mrs. Callahan across the street, who has her own smaller canning operation each September and seems to genuinely enjoy having a small girl underfoot, asking questions about her chickens while the grown women work. By the time the last jar seals with its particular satisfying pop, a sound Dottie still finds quietly thrilling even after several years of hearing it, the pantry holds enough preserved tomatoes to see the household through most of the winter's sauces and soups, enough green beans to supplement whatever canned varieties get purchased at the grocery store across the colder months, and a modest but genuinely treasured supply of peach preserves that will appear, in small careful spoonfuls, on Sunday morning biscuits clear through until the following summer's fruit finally comes in to replace it. There is a particular, specific pride Dottie takes in this pantry that differs somewhat from the pride she takes in her clean sheets on the line or her carefully pressed shirts, a pride rooted less in appearance, since nobody outside the family ever really sees these shelves, and more in the plain, physical fact of provision, actual food secured against an actual winter through her own direct labor, a skill inherited across at least 3 generations of women in her family, and one she fully intends, though Susan is still far too young to properly begin learning it, to pass along in turn when the time eventually comes. Walter's contribution to Canning Week amounts mostly to eating dinner standing up at the counter those particular evenings, since the kitchen table tends to be occupied by cooling jars for most of the process, and to periodically remarking, with what Dottie has come to recognize as genuine if slightly bemused admiration, that he has never in his life seen a person work quite so hard over quite so many small glass jars, a comment Dottie generally receives as the specific, backhanded compliment it is clearly intended to be, and takes, on the whole, in exactly the good humour with which it is offered. Tonight, this particular Monday in October, with its pork chops and its television programs and its ordinary quiet bedtime routine, sits comfortably on the other side of all that September labour, the pantry shelves full, the hard physical work of securing the coming winter already behind this household. And there is something worth noticing in that too, the way an ordinary, restful evening like this one is itself made possible by weeks of considerably less restful labour that came before it, work that nobody sees or comments on once it is finished, but that sits quietly on those shelves nonetheless, gleaming jar after gleaming jar, doing its own patient invisible work of keeping this family fed clear through to spring. Let us rewind again for a moment, back to the hours between 8 in the morning and 3:30 in the afternoon, hours we passed over quickly earlier because Dottie was not present to witness them directly, but that deserve their own attention now, because Tommy's school day is its own small, complete world, one worth stepping into properly. The school itself, that low brick building finished only the year before last, holds Tommy's 3rd grade classroom in a corner room with windows facing the playground, rows of wooden desks bolted to the floor in the older fashion. Though there is talk among the teachers, Tommy's mother has heard through the Parent Association grapevine of newer schools being built with movable desks instead, a change that strikes the more traditional teachers on staff as faintly suspicious, an unnecessary complication to a system that has, in their view, worked perfectly well for decades already. Tommy's teacher, a Miss Halloran, is young, perhaps only 23 or 24, unmarried, living still with her own parents a few towns over, and possessed of the specific, slightly nervous energy of someone still finding her footing in a profession she genuinely loves but has not yet fully settled into. She favours Tommy in the mild, undeclared way teachers sometimes favour a particular student, drawn to his enthusiasm for arithmetic, a subject most of his classmates approach with considerably less relish, and she has taken to giving him small extra problems to work through during the periods when the rest of the class is still catching up, a kindness Tommy accepts with visible pride, and that has, if Dottie is honest, gone slightly to his head in the specific way that early academic praise tends to do to an 8-year-old boy. The school day follows a rhythm as fixed and reliable as anything in the adult world we have spent tonight examining. Arithmetic first thing, when the class is freshest, followed by reading, a subject Tommy tolerates rather than loves, preferring books about baseball and adventure to the more literary selections Miss Halloran occasionally introduces. There is a mid-morning recess, 20 minutes on the playground behind the school, a stretch of asphalt and a patch of grass worn thin by generations of running feet, though this particular school has only existed for 2 years, meaning the thinning grass reflects an impressively concentrated amount of use in a remarkably short span of time. Lunch happens at noon, most children carrying a lunch from home in a metal pail, not unlike the one Walter carries to his own office, though a hot lunch program has recently been introduced for children whose families prefer it, a development some of the more established mothers on the Parent Association have debated with surprising intensity, a few holding the position that a proper mother packs her own child's lunch, and a hot program represents an unnecessary and slightly suspicious government intrusion into domestic responsibility, a debate Dottie finds mildly exhausting and generally avoids weighing in on directly, though she continues, for now, to pack Tommy's lunch herself each morning, less out of any strong conviction on the matter, and more because he has never once expressed the slightest interest in the alternative. The afternoon includes a spelling lesson, a period devoted to what the curriculum calls civics, involving simple lessons about community helpers and the basic structure of local government, delivered at a level appropriate to 8-year-olds but earnest in its intent to begin building, even this early, a foundational sense of civic responsibility. There is often a period for what Miss Halloran calls art, though the materials available amount mostly to construction paper, blunt scissors, and a limited palette of crayons, resources that nonetheless produce, on Tommy's bedroom wall at home, a rotating gallery of drawings that Dottie displays with genuine pride regardless of their actual artistic merit. The current selection including a fairly ambitious, if anatomically questionable, rendering of a baseball game in progress. The specific incident Tommy narrated at snack time this afternoon, involving a kickball dispute with a boy named Ronald, happened during afternoon recess and represents in miniature the entire social ecosystem of an 8-year-old boy's world, a world with its own codes of fairness, its own hierarchies of athletic reputation, its own genuinely felt injustices that loom, in the moment, every bit as large to Tommy as Walter's grievance about Edmund and the stolen credit for an idea looms in the adult world of the insurance office. Dottie has learned over years of parenting to receive these small daily dramas with total seriousness while they are being told, and with a private, affectionate perspective that recognizes their essential, harmless smallness, a balance that took her longer to strike than she would probably admit to anyone outside this house. We have followed Dottie through nearly every hour of her day now, and Tommy through his school day as well. But there is a whole stretch of hours belonging to Walter that we have skipped past almost entirely, the roughly 9 hours between backing the Chevrolet down the driveway this morning and pulling back in at 6:05 this evening. And I think that stretch deserves at least a brief visit before we let this particular day close for good. The insurance office where Walter works occupies the 4th and 5th floors of a stone-faced building downtown, a solid, unglamorous structure built sometime around the turn of the century, its lobby floored in checkered marble that has gone slightly dull from decades of foot traffic, its elevator operated by an elderly man named Mr. Pruitt, who has run that same brass-gated car up and down the same shaft for longer than most of the younger clerks in the building have been alive. Walter's own desk sits in a long open room on the 4th floor, one of perhaps 30 identical desks arranged in neat rows beneath a bank of tall windows, each desk holding a black telephone, a blotter, a small stack of wire trays for incoming and outgoing paperwork, and whatever small personal touches each clerk has been permitted to add. In Walter's case, a framed photograph of Dottie and the children taken last summer at a company picnic, and a chipped ceramic mug that once held pencils and now holds, more accurately, a small chaotic thicket of pencils, paper clips, and a broken rubber band or two. His work itself involves processing claims, mostly related to homeowners and automobile policies, a task that requires a specific combination of careful attention to detail and a working knowledge of the company's fairly elaborate rulebook, knowledge Walter has built up over nearly 6 years at the firm, to the point where he can often assess a claim's basic validity within the first few minutes of reading through it, though the actual paperwork, cross-referencing policy numbers and coverage limits and prior claim history, takes considerably longer than that first instinctive read suggests it should. The Henderson account Walter mentioned so often over dinner tonight belongs to a completely different Henderson than the family next door, a coincidence that struck Dottie as amusing when she first realized it, and that Walter still occasionally finds himself having to clarify at the dinner table, this Henderson being a small manufacturing concern on the north side of the city, whose insurance renewal Walter has been quietly, diligently managing for the better part of 2 months. The kind of account that carries enough weight if it renews successfully to reflect meaningfully well on Walter's own standing within the department come the annual review each spring. The office runs on its own small rhythms, not unlike the household we have spent the rest of tonight inside. There is a mid-morning coffee break, taken standing near a percolator kept on a side table by one of the windows, where the younger clerks trade gossip about the department's various small rivalries, and the older ones mostly discuss baseball, or, more recently, the specific merits of one television model over another, a conversation that has apparently overtaken the office nearly as completely as it has overtaken every household on Maple Terrace. Lunch happens at noon, most of the men eating at their desks or in a small nearby diner that does a brisk trade in meatloaf and coffee, Walter usually opting for the diner 2 or 3 days a week, and a sandwich carried from home the other days, depending on how the department's workload happens to be running that particular week. Edmund, the colleague whose grievance occupied a portion of tonight's dinner conversation, sits 2 desks over from Walter, a slightly older man with an easy, confident manner that Walter privately finds a touch too polished, a suspicion that hardened considerably this past week when Edmund presented, in a meeting with their shared supervisor, an idea about streamlining the claims intake process that Walter is fairly certain originated in a conversation the two of them had at the coffee percolator not 2 weeks earlier, a small office injustice that Walter has decided, after some internal deliberation, is not quite worth a direct confrontation, but that he has clearly not yet fully let go of either, evidenced by how much of tonight's dinner table time it managed to occupy. There is a particular quality to this whole world. The marble lobby and Mr. Pruitt's brass elevator and the rows of identical desks beneath the tall windows that stands in real contrast to the world we have spent most of tonight inside, Dottie's kitchen and clothesline and mending basket. Walter's day is measured out in claims processed and meetings attended and small office politics carefully managed, a different kind of labour than Dottie's, less physically active perhaps, but every bit as structured, every bit as governed by its own unspoken rules and expectations, and every bit as invisible, in its own way, to anyone outside the specific room where it happens, since a man's working day, much like a woman's working day at home, tends to remain a fairly abstract thing to the family waiting for him at the other end of it, known mostly through the stories he chooses to bring home across the dinner table, rather than through any direct, shared witness of the hours themselves. Walter leaves the office most days a few minutes past 5, waits with a cluster of other departing clerks for Mr. Pruitt's elevator, and steps back out into the marble lobby and then the street beyond it, the specific transition from the 4th floor's fluorescent hum back into the ordinary daylight and noise of the city always producing, for him, a small private feeling he has never quite found the words to describe to Dottie, something like surfacing, the particular relief of a mind that has spent 9 hours narrowly focused on claims and coverage limits, finally being permitted to widen out again toward the ordinary, unstructured thoughts of a man walking to his car at the end of a working day, thinking about traffic on the highway and dinner waiting at home, and whether Tommy's kickball dispute with the boy named Ronald ever got properly resolved. There is one more corner of this house we have not yet properly visited tonight, and it belongs almost entirely to Walter, a narrow workbench built along the back wall of the single-car garage, assembled by Walter himself during the first spring they lived in this house, out of scrap lumber and a second-hand vise he picked up from a hardware store's bargain bin. This is where Walter retreats on Saturday afternoons, when the weather does not cooperate with yard work, and occasionally on a weeknight for 20 or 30 minutes after the children are in bed, though tonight, as we have seen, he chose the record player and the armchair instead. The bench holds a modest but carefully organized collection of tools, hung on a pegboard he installed with a level of precision that borders on the fussy, each tool's outline traced in pencil directly onto the pegboard itself, so that any tool out of place announces its absence immediately, a small system of order that Walter maintains, with a satisfaction he rarely articulates, but that Dottie recognizes as, in its way, the exact male equivalent of her own careful management of the linen closet. Currently underway on the workbench is a birdhouse, intended, Walter has announced with more confidence than the project's actual progress currently justifies, to be finished in time for Susan's birthday next month, a modest wooden structure with a peaked roof that Walter is building from a plan clipped out of a magazine, working through it slowly and with evident pleasure across several unhurried evening sessions, sanding a joint here, test-fitting a piece there, the whole project moving forward less out of any urgent necessity and more because Walter has discovered, in the past year or so, a genuine, quiet satisfaction in working with his hands on something that has no relationship whatsoever to insurance claims or office politics. The car itself, that two-tone Chevrolet in green and cream, occupies the other half of the garage, and Walter's relationship to it deserves its own small mention, since a man's automobile in this particular decade carries a weight of significance that goes well beyond simple transportation. He washes it most Saturday mornings, weather permitting, a ritual involving a bucket of soapy water, a chamois cloth kept specifically for this purpose, and a level of attention to the chrome trim that Dottie finds equal parts endearing and mildly excessive. He checks the oil himself rather than paying a station to do it, a skill his own father taught him and that he takes a specific, quiet pride in maintaining, and he speaks about the car's performance, its handling on the highway curve near the office, its fuel economy compared to the Henderson's newer model next door, with an enthusiasm and a vocabulary considerably more animated than he brings to almost any other subject in his ordinary conversation. I find this small corner of the house genuinely worth pausing on, because it represents something we have not talked about much tonight, a private individual pleasure that belongs entirely to Walter, separate from his role as husband or father or provider, a space where he is simply a man who enjoys building a birdhouse slightly imperfectly and keeping a car slightly too clean. Every person in this house, it turns out, if you look closely enough, carries some small private world like this one: Dottie's afternoon hour with a book, Tommy's baseball statistics, Susan's ongoing campaign for a dog that does not exist, Walter's pegboard and his birdhouse and his chamois cloth, each of them a small quiet corner of individual selfhood, tucked inside the larger shared structure of this family's daily rhythm. Since we are already wandering a bit outside the strict boundaries of this single Monday, let me tell you about tomorrow morning, because Tuesday holds its own small institution in Dottie's week that deserves mention, one she is already looking forward to even now, tidying the kitchen after a long day. Most Tuesday mornings, once Walter has left for work and the children for school, 4 or 5 women from this stretch of the street gather at one house or another, rotating the location week to week, for what everyone simply calls coffee, though the gathering runs considerably longer and covers considerably more ground than the name suggests. Marge hosts most often, her kitchen being, by general unspoken consensus, the most comfortable of the available options, with a breakfast nook built into a bay window that catches the morning light particularly well, and seats the whole group without anyone having to balance a cup awkwardly on a knee. The conversation at these gatherings ranges widely and candidly in a way that surprises people, Dottie has noticed, who assume from the outside that women of this particular time and place spoke only of recipes and children. Recipes and children do come up, plenty of them, an exchange yesterday about a stubborn stain and the merits of a new laundry product, an ongoing, half-worried discussion about whether the Palmer's baby, due around Christmas, will arrive before or after the holiday itself, a debate about the wisdom of the hot lunch program at the school that mirrors, almost exactly, the one happening simultaneously among a different set of mothers at the Parent Association. But the conversation also moves into territory considerably more personal, more searching, the private frustrations and quiet satisfactions of marriages that none of these women would ever discuss with their own husbands in quite this same unguarded way. There is a specific kind of honesty available in this particular room, among this particular group of women, that exists almost nowhere else in any of their lives, not with their own mothers, whose expectations feel to most of them subtly different from their own, and certainly not with their husbands, who occupy a completely separate emotional category in the domestic arrangement of the time. Marge, for instance, mentioned last week, in the specific lowered voice reserved for the gathering's more serious moments, a real and ongoing worry about her husband's drinking, not a crisis exactly, nothing dramatic, but a pattern she has noticed accumulating slowly over the past year that she does not quite know what to do with, and the response from the other women in the room was not advice exactly, or not only advice, but something closer to simple, attentive witness, the specific relief of having a worry heard by people who understood its weight without either minimizing it or turning it into more of a crisis than it currently is. Dottie has come to treasure these Tuesday mornings more than she would probably admit directly even to Walter, who regards the gathering with a kind of amused, slightly baffled tolerance, aware that something important happens there without quite being able to identify what it is. What happens, if I had to put words to it, is something like a private university, an informal, entirely unofficial institution where a group of intelligent women, most of whom left behind whatever formal education or career ambitions they once held, gather weekly to think out loud together, to test ideas, to offer each other a kind of intellectual and emotional companionship that the rest of their carefully structured week simply does not provide space for anywhere else. This particular Tuesday's gathering, tomorrow morning, will happen at Dottie's own kitchen table, her turn in the rotation, and she has already, even tonight, begun mentally preparing for it in the small, pleasurable way a person prepares for something they are genuinely looking forward to, deciding on a coffee cake to bake in the morning before the women arrive, running through, half-consciously, the various threads of conversation she might raise. A magazine article she read last week about a controversial new novel, a question she has been meaning to ask Marge's opinion on regarding a household repair, the ordinary, rich texture of a friendship built week after week across a shared kitchen table. There is a smaller thread from earlier today worth pulling on a little further before we move toward the close of this particular evening, something Walter's mother raised at that Sunday dinner, and that has been sitting quietly in the back of Dottie's mind ever since, which is Susan's approaching enrollment in kindergarten come September. It is still nearly a year away, technically, but the paperwork has already arrived from the school district, sitting now in a folder in the drop front desk alongside the household ledger and the folder of loan documents, and Dottie finds herself thinking about it more often than the actual timeline would seem to require. There is something in the prospect that catches at her in a way she has not fully examined, a recognition that this will mark the first morning in nearly 6 years that Dottie will have absolutely no small person requiring her direct attention during the daylight hours, both children finally, fully, out of the house from morning until mid-afternoon. She mentioned this, once, briefly to Marge during one of their Tuesday mornings, this odd, unexpected flicker of feeling about a milestone that every other mother on this street seems to discuss purely in terms of relief and expanded freedom, and Marge, whose own youngest will not start school for another 2 years yet, listened with the specific quality of attention she brings to these more searching conversations, and said simply that it made sense to feel several things about it at once, gladness and a genuine small grief both, since 6 years of a certain kind of daily companionship do not simply end without leaving some kind of mark behind. Dottie found this response more useful than any reassurance would have been, the plain acknowledgement that a feeling can be complicated without needing to be resolved into something simpler. For tonight, though, Susan is still very much a 5-year-old at home, currently asleep down the hall with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, and Dottie's thoughts drift, as they sometimes do at this hour, from Susan's future classroom back to her own reflection, caught briefly in the mirror above the small dressing table in the corner of her and Walter's bedroom, a modest piece of furniture with 3 drawers and an oval mirror that Dottie visits each night before bed, unpinning the day's hairstyle, applying a light film of cold cream to her face with the same brisk, practiced motions she has performed every single night of her adult life. The dressing table holds a small collection of items that would tell a stranger a good deal about Dottie if that stranger ever had cause to examine them closely. A bottle of rosewater lotion, a compact of face powder in a shade slightly lighter than her natural colouring, a small dish for hairpins, a photograph in a simple frame of Walter in his uniform from those final months of the war, taken just before he shipped out, a photograph she has looked at perhaps 10,000 times over the years, and that still, occasionally, catches her with a small unexpected pang, remembering the specific fear of that particular stretch of months, a fear that feels, from the comfortable distance of this ordinary October evening, almost like it belonged to a different woman entirely. There is also, tucked into the corner of the table's smallest drawer, a strand of pearls, not real ones, but a good quality imitation that Walter gave her for their 5th anniversary last year, worn only on special occasions, a small object that carries for Dottie a specific and genuine sentimental weight entirely disproportionate to its modest actual value, precisely the kind of object that fills a life like this one, not grand, not remarkable to anyone outside this particular marriage, but rich, privately, with a whole history of meaning that only the 2 people who share it could ever fully read. Since we visited Dottie's dressing table a little while ago, and that old photograph of Walter in his uniform sitting on it, let me tell you the fuller story behind that photograph, because it is a good one, and Dottie herself still tells it, on the rare occasion she is asked, with a specific warmth that has not faded in the slightest across 7 years of marriage. They met at a dance, the particular kind of wartime dance that towns and church groups and civic organizations organized constantly during those years, part genuine social occasion and part deliberate morale effort, meant to give servicemen passing through on their way to training or deployment a proper evening before whatever came next. Dottie attended with two girlfriends from the secretarial college, more out of a sense of civic duty than any real expectation of romance, since by that point in the war she had attended perhaps a dozen similar evenings, and had grown mildly, cheerfully cynical about the whole enterprise, the earnest young men in uniform, the slightly too eager conversation, the sense that everyone present was performing a version of normal social life that the actual circumstances of the moment made almost impossible to fully inhabit. Walter, for his part, had exactly 1 week of leave before shipping out, and had been dragged to the dance by a fellow serviceman who insisted, with the particular persuasive energy of a man determined not to spend his last week stateside sitting in a barracks, that they owed it to themselves to at least try to enjoy the evening properly. Walter has always maintained in his own retelling that he noticed Dottie almost immediately, standing near the refreshment table with her two friends, laughing at something one of them had said with a specific, unguarded openness that struck him, he says, as different from the careful, performed brightness most of the young women in the room seemed to be working so hard to project. He asked her to dance twice that evening, and the second time, during a slower number, made the specific mistake, which Dottie has never once let him forget across 7 years of marriage, of stepping directly onto her foot hard enough to leave a small bruise she discovered the following morning, an incident Walter blames, to this day, on nerves rather than any genuine deficiency in his dancing, a defense Dottie accepts with visible amusement but has never fully granted him. They spent most of that remaining week together, walking through downtown in the evenings, sitting for hours in a corner booth at a diner not unlike the one Walter still frequents near his office today, talking with the specific, accelerated intimacy that wartime seemed to produce in nearly every young couple fortunate enough to find each other during those particular years. A full week's worth of getting to know someone compressed by circumstance into conversations that might, in an ordinary peacetime courtship, have unfolded gradually across many months instead. The photograph on Dottie's dressing table was taken on his final evening in town, at her insistence, since she wanted, she has said more than once, something to actually hold on to, rather than simply a memory that might, given the uncertainty of everything ahead, prove to be all that remained. They wrote to each other constantly across the following year and a half, letters that Dottie still keeps, tied together with a faded ribbon, in a box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, letters full of the specific, careful hopefulness that people write when they are trying, across a genuine and real distance, to build something durable out of nothing more substantial than words on paper and the memory of one particular week. Walter came home in the autumn, thinner than he had left, quieter in certain ways that Dottie noticed immediately but knew better than to press him about too directly, and they married the following spring, a modest ceremony at Dottie's family church, attended by both sets of parents and a small gathering of friends, followed by 2 years in that small apartment downtown, while Walter finished his degree and Dottie worked the front desk at the insurance office, where he would eventually, through a connection made during those same 2 years, secure the position he still holds today. I find something genuinely moving in this story every time I think about it. The specific, accelerated intimacy of a wartime courtship, a single compressed week that somehow proved sturdy enough to anchor an entire subsequent marriage, 7 years and 2 children and 1 small blue house on a curving street deep, all of it tracing back to a dance neither of them particularly wanted to attend, and a misstepped foot that left an actual bruise. There is something in that worth noticing, I think, the way an entire ordinary life, the one we have spent tonight walking through in such careful detail, can trace its whole architecture back to a single evening that felt at the time like nothing more than one small forgettable dance among many. One more small thing before we let this house rest completely. A short story about that stuffed rabbit currently tucked beneath Susan's chin down the hall, since it has come up more than once tonight and deserves, I think, its proper telling. Walter's mother made it, actually, the winter before Susan was born, working from a simple pattern clipped out of a magazine, stitching it by hand over several evenings in front of her own fireplace while she waited, along with the rest of the family, for her first granddaughter to arrive. It was meant, originally, to be a fairly ordinary nursery gift, one among several soft toys that arrived that particular winter, but somewhere across the following months it became, through no particular decision anyone made on purpose, the specific object Susan reached for first, above every other toy in her crib, a preference that solidified sometime around her first birthday and has never once wavered since. The fur along its left ear, worn down now to almost nothing, tells its own small history if you know how to read it. 3 years of being dragged along on car trips and carried into the yard and, on at least one memorable occasion, left behind entirely at Walter's parents' house, discovered missing only at bedtime, prompting a frantic telephone call and an unplanned late-evening drive back across town that both Walter and Dottie still describe, when the story comes up, as one of the more genuinely stressful hours of Susan's short life so far, resolved only when the rabbit was recovered, slightly dusty but otherwise intact, from beneath the very chair where Walter's mother had been sitting when she first made it. Susan does not know this whole history, not yet, not in any detail she could recite back to you. To her, the rabbit is simply the rabbit, present for as long as she can remember, a fixed and permanent feature of her particular small world, in the same way the house itself is, or her parents, or the specific sound of the ice cream truck's bell drifting through an open window on a summer evening. But Dottie knows the whole of it, every stitch her mother-in-law worked into that worn fabric on a cold winter evening years ago, every mile it has travelled tucked under a small chin, and there is something in that private knowledge, held quietly by a mother while her daughter sleeps peacefully unaware of it, that captures in miniature a great deal of what parenting itself actually is, all of that unseen history and unseen love folded invisibly into one small, ordinary, threadbare object resting now in the dark down the hall. Let us return now, gently, to where we left Walter and Dottie a little while ago, rising from the living room at the end of their quiet hour together, beginning the small nightly circuit through the house that closes out nearly every evening in this household, in more or less the same order, a sequence so familiar that neither of them consciously thinks through the steps anymore, the way you do not think through the steps of walking down a staircase you have climbed 10,000 times before. Walter starts in the kitchen, checking that the back door is properly latched, a habit left over, he has admitted once or twice, from a specific unease he still occasionally carries from his time overseas, a heightened, quiet vigilance about locked doors and secured windows that he has never fully shed, and that Dottie has learnt simply to accommodate without comment, understanding it as one of the small, private costs Walter carries from those years, a cost he does not discuss but that surfaces, gently and without drama, in small habits like this one. He checks the stove as well, confirming each burner is fully off, a redundant check since Dottie herself already confirmed it hours earlier during the dinner cleanup, but a redundancy neither of them has ever thought worth eliminating, since it costs nothing, and occasionally, rarely, catches something genuinely worth catching. The thermostat in the front hallway gets its own attention next, Walter adjusting it down a few degrees for the night, a habit of thrift as much as comfort, since a house kept slightly cooler overnight, warmed instead by an extra blanket, costs noticeably less over the course of a winter than one held at a constant daytime temperature around the clock, a small calculation Walter runs through instinctively now after several winters of tracking the oil delivery bills against the household's broader budget. Dottie, meanwhile, makes a final pass through the living room, straightening a cushion Susan displaced earlier while watching television, gathering a stray toy left on the floor, a small wooden truck of Tommy's that has wandered, as toys tend to, considerably further from his room than he probably realizes. She switches off the lamp beside the sofa, leaving only the small light over the kitchen stove burning, a habit maintained specifically so that anyone rising in the night, a child needing water, Walter himself if sleep proves elusive, can find their way through the dark house without stumbling. The final stop on this nightly circuit is the children's rooms, a brief, quiet check that both parents make together most nights, standing for a moment in each doorway rather than fully entering, careful not to disturb sleep that has by this hour settled deep and genuine. Tommy sleeps the specific, total way of an 8-year-old boy who spent a good portion of his afternoon in vigorous outdoor play, one arm flung outside the blanket, the baseball pennant above his headboard barely visible in the dim light from the hallway nightlight. Susan sleeps curled more tightly, the rabbit still tucked beneath her chin exactly where it was when Walter left her earlier this evening, her breathing slow and even in the particular unguarded way that makes watching a sleeping child, even briefly, one of the quietly profound small pleasures available to any parent. Neither Walter nor Dottie says much during this part of the nightly circuit. There is not much that needs saying. They simply stand together for a moment in each doorway, a small shared pause that has become, over years of repetition, its own private form of gratitude, unstated but genuinely felt, for two children sleeping soundly in a house that both of them worked, in their different ways, all day long to keep warm and fed and steady around them. Their own bedroom, when they finally reach it a little after 10:30, holds the particular hush of a room at the very end of a long, full day. Curtains drawn against the streetlight outside, the chenille spread already turned back in the corner where Dottie folded it down earlier while getting Susan settled across the hall. Dottie sits at the dressing table we visited a little while ago, working through her nightly routine with the same unhurried, practiced economy that governs nearly every task in her day, unpinning the curls she set that morning, brushing her hair out in long, even strokes, applying the cold cream, each motion following the last in a sequence worn so smooth through years of repetition that she could, and often does, perform the whole routine while thinking about something else entirely. Tonight it is tomorrow's coffee cake, whether she has enough flour on hand or needs to add it to a list for the grocery trip later in the week. Walter, meanwhile, hangs his trousers on the wooden valet stand in the corner, a small furniture piece designed specifically to keep a crease properly set overnight, empties his pockets onto the dresser, a modest ritual of coins and a folded receipt and his wedding ring, which he removes each night out of habit rather than any particular necessity, setting it beside the small dish where Dottie's own jewellery rests when she is not wearing it. He winds the clock on his own nightstand, a small brass alarm that will sound again at 6 tomorrow morning to begin the whole cycle once more, checking the time against his wristwatch with a precision that seems, at this late hour, almost comically thorough for a routine that has never once actually failed him. There is a brief exchange between them before the light finally goes out, the kind of low, unhurried conversation that happens in nearly every bedroom at the end of nearly every ordinary day, a final confirmation of tomorrow's small logistics, Dottie mentioning the coffee gathering at their house in the morning, a reminder that Walter needs to be up slightly earlier than usual for an early meeting, a brief warm remark about the pork chops having turned out particularly well tonight, a small compliment that Dottie receives with the specific quiet pleasure of a woman whose careful daily competence is, in this one small moment before sleep, genuinely and directly acknowledged. Walter switches off the bedside lamp, and the room settles into the particular darkness of a suburban bedroom at nearly 11 at night, not total darkness, since a thin seam of light still traces the edge of the curtains from the street lamp outside, but dark enough, quiet enough, that sleep arrives for both of them within a matter of minutes, the specific, deep, unhurried sleep of two people who have spent an entire day in genuinely full and purposeful motion and have, at the end of it, absolutely nothing left over that needs to keep them awake. I want to pause here, just for a moment, before we let this particular day close completely, and notice something about the shape of what we have just walked through together. This day held no crisis, no dramatic turn, nothing that would make for an especially compelling story if you were forced to summarize it in a single sentence for someone in a hurry. And yet I think, if you have been sitting with me through all of it, you can feel how full it actually was, how many small competencies and small tendernesses and small private moments it managed to hold inside its ordinary 24 hours. That fullness, I think, is the actual subject of tonight's story, more than any single event within it. Beyond the walls of this particular bedroom, the rest of Maple Terrace is settling into its own version of the same nightly quiet, house after house along the curving street going dark in a loose, staggered sequence that has no formal order but follows, more or less, the same general rhythm night after night. The Hendersons next door turned in perhaps 20 minutes ago, their youngest having kept them up slightly later than usual, with a case of the specific resistant wakefulness that occasionally afflicts children right at the edge of adolescence, a low murmur of a bedtime negotiation Dottie could faintly hear through the shared wall of their two houses earlier, now finally resolved into silence. The Palmer's house, 2 doors down, still shows a single light in an upstairs window, Joan Palmer likely reading in bed, sleep increasingly elusive in these final months before Christmas and the arrival of her first child, a specific private discomfort that the other women on the street have all begun offering quiet, practical advice about during the Tuesday morning gatherings, remedies for restless legs and swollen ankles passed along with the easy generosity of women who remember themselves exactly what these final weeks feel like. Mrs. Callahan's old farmhouse across the street sits dark and settled, has been for at least an hour, since she keeps by her own cheerful admission the hours of someone considerably older than the rest of the block, in bed most nights before 9 and up again well before the milkman's truck makes its rounds, tending to her chickens in the pale grey light before most of the neighbourhood has even considered stirring. There is something almost anchoring about her presence on this street. Dottie has thought more than once, a single visible thread connecting this brand new subdivision back to whatever quieter, older rhythm of rural life occupied this exact patch of ground before the developers arrived with their surveying stakes and their standardized floor plans. Marge's house, 4 doors down, shows a light still in the kitchen, and Dottie can picture, without needing to actually see it, exactly what her friend is likely doing at this hour. Finishing the last of the evening's dishes, perhaps, or sitting with her own household ledger, the way Dottie herself does most Sunday evenings, or simply enjoying a final quiet cup of something after her own 2 children have gone down for the night. Tomorrow morning that same kitchen will host, temporarily, an entirely different scene. 5 women gathered around Dottie's own table instead, coffee cake and conversation, and the particular, valuable honesty this street's women have built together across nearly 2 years of Tuesday mornings. Further down, past the cul-de-sac at the street's far end, the newest houses, finished only this past summer, still stand mostly empty, a handful of families having moved in over the past several weeks, the rest of the lots waiting for buyers who will arrive, presumably over the coming months, drawn by the same combination of low down payments and post-war optimism that brought every other family on this street to this particular curving road. In perhaps a year, those houses too will hold their own version of tonight's scene, their own particular Walters and Dotties and Tommies and Susans, settling into their own nightly rhythms, joining the loose, accelerated intimacy of a neighborhood built almost entirely, from the ground up, in the space of a single remarkable decade. Above the whole street, the October sky has cleared, a scatter of stars visible despite the faint orange wash of the street lamps, and somewhere out past the edge of the subdivision, past the last unfinished lots and the remaining fringe of the original farmland not yet claimed by construction, the night holds the same particular stillness it has held over this ground for longer than any single family currently sleeping here could properly account for. A stillness that predates the surveying stakes and the poured concrete driveways and the wire-staked young maple trees by a considerable margin, and that will in its own patient way outlast them too. There is one more thing I want to mention before we let this house rest completely, something that has nothing to do with any particular person or task we have followed tonight, and everything to do with the house itself, the specific collection of small sounds a structure like this one makes once every human inside it has finally gone quiet. A new house settles differently than an old one. The wooden frame, still curing, still adjusting to its foundation after only 5 years in the ground, produces small ticks and creaks through the night that Dottie noticed constantly during their first months living here, and has, by now, stopped consciously registering at all. The particular pop of a floor joist somewhere beneath the hallway, the faint tin sound of the roof contracting slightly as the evening air cools against it, sounds that would alarm a person unfamiliar with this specific house, but that read, to Dottie and Walter both, as nothing more than the ordinary, private language a home speaks to itself once its people have gone to sleep. The refrigerator in the kitchen cycles on briefly around midnight, its compressor humming for several minutes before falling silent again, a rhythm so consistent that Dottie could probably tell you, blindfolded, roughly what time it is based on nothing more than which phase of that particular cycle happens to be running. Somewhere in the utility room, a pipe ticks faintly as the last of the day's hot water finishes working its way through the system. Outside, very faint, carried on whatever direction the wind happens to be moving tonight, a dog barks twice somewhere several streets over and then falls quiet, answered by nothing. the bark simply absorbed into the wider stillness of the whole sleeping subdivision. I find something genuinely comforting in this specific catalogue of small sounds, the sounds a house makes when it is, in every meaningful sense, entirely at peace. There is no anxious note in any of them. The furnace ticking as it cools is not a house in distress, it is a house doing exactly what a house is supposed to do at the end of a long day, quietly, patiently holding its shape around the people sleeping inside it, making its small private adjustments in the dark the way a person might shift slightly in their sleep without ever fully waking. If you have ever lain awake, even briefly, in a house not your own, or in your very first apartment, or in the home you grew up in on some long ago night when sleep would not quite come, you likely know this particular sensation, the strange comfort of listening to a building breathe around you, learning its specific vocabulary of creaks and ticks and distant hums, until they stop sounding like anything worth noticing at all, and simply become instead the sound of safety itself, the specific, wordless reassurance that the walls are holding, the roof is steady, and everyone you love is exactly where they are supposed to be. That is the sound this particular house is making right now, on this particular October night, on this particular curving street that did not exist 5 years ago, and will in another 5 years feel as settled and permanent as if it had always been there. A house ticking gently into sleep around a family who worked hard, all day long, in 100 small and mostly invisible ways, simply to arrive at this exact moment, this exact stillness, this exact ordinary peace. And so the house on Maple Terrace settles fully into sleep, the way it does most nights, the way houses like it settled into sleep on 1,000 streets very much like this one, all across the country, during this particular narrow window of American time. The percolator sits clean and ready on the stove for tomorrow's 6 o'clock ritual. The mended socks rest folded in the wicker basket. The birdhouse waits, half-finished, on the workbench in the dark garage, its peaked roof still needing a final coat of sanding before Susan's birthday next month. The ledger sits closed in the drop front desk, this week's numbers all accounted for, next week's already beginning to take shape in the back of Dottie's mind even as she sleeps. There is something I keep coming back to, turning over gently the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your pocket, about a day like the one we have spent together tonight. Nothing in it would make the newspaper. Nothing in it would survive, on its own, as a story worth telling a stranger at a party. And yet here we are, having spent well over an hour together inside its particular texture, the specific hiss of a hot iron over cotton, the specific sound of a screen door easing shut, the specific warmth of a kitchen at 6 in the evening with pork chops in the skillet and 2 children washing up for dinner down the hall. I think that fullness, that sheer accumulated richness of small, unremarkable moments, might be the truest thing about any ordinary life, this one or any other, then or now. Maybe you recognized pieces of your own family in this house tonight, a grandmother's kitchen, a father's workbench, the specific sound of a screen door on its spring. Or maybe none of it matched your own history at all, and you simply enjoyed, for an hour, the particular pleasure of visiting a life entirely different from your own, watching from a comfortable distance as Dottie hung her wash, and Walter backed his Chevrolet down the driveway, and Tommy narrated his baseball statistics to an audience that had stopped fully listening several sentences earlier. Either way, I am glad you stayed for the whole of it. The lights are out now, all through the house. The furnace, not yet needed through a full winter night, sits quiet in the small utility space off the basement stairs. The television, so recently and thoroughly the object of this family's genuine wonder, stands dark in its wooden cabinet, waiting for tomorrow evening's programming. Somewhere down the hall, Tommy has shifted slightly in his sleep, one arm now tucked back beneath the blanket. Susan's rabbit has slipped a few inches from where it started the night, though her hand still rests near enough to find it again without waking. And in the front bedroom, Walter and Dottie sleep the specific, unhurried sleep of 2 people who worked hard, in their different and complementary ways, at the ordinary considerable task of keeping a small house and a small family steady and warm and fed for one more day. Tomorrow will bring its own version of today. The alarm at 6, the percolator, the coffee gathering at Dottie's own kitchen table, Walter's early meeting, Tommy's arithmetic, Susan's ongoing campaign for a dog that does not yet exist. The rhythm will repeat, gently, the way it always does, the way it will keep doing for years yet, through winters and summers, through Susan's eventual first day of kindergarten, and Tommy's eventual growth spurts, and whatever changes, large and small, the coming years happen to bring to this particular street and this particular family. But that is tomorrow's story, and tomorrow's story can wait. For tonight, everything is where it belongs. The doors are locked, the children are sleeping, the house is warm and quiet, and entirely, completely at rest. And so, I think, are you, or very nearly there, if you have made it this far with me into the deep, soft hours of the night. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever kind of day you have had, whatever kind of house or apartment or room currently holds you as you drift towards sleep, I hope some small piece of this quiet, ordinary evening on Maple Terrace has settled into you the way it was meant to, gently, without hurry, the way a good, unremarkable day settles into memory long after anything more dramatic has faded away entirely. Sleep well, friend. The lights are out, the street is quiet, and somewhere, still, in the particular soft dark of an October night in the middle of the last century, that little blue house is standing exactly where it has always stood, holding its ordinary, extraordinary family safely inside it until morning comes again.